whoa, like, what do you mean I need to shoot 50 doe on this 1,000 acres? It's like, you have way too many deer, like an astronomical amount. And you're affecting the resource, the space, you're affecting your bucks ultimately because of that.
And probably the most common argument you hear to that is, well, during the rut, I've got all the doe, so the bucks are going to show up here.
That's it.
You know, and there's some validity to some of those comments. And so I'm like, I'm not Brian from QDMA. I don't know. I don't know. So, but we have him here, so. The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Deer Grow.
Man, it's almost food plot season, Jared, and Deer Grow is one of those products that has really changed the way that we plant food plots and the success we've seen from them.
No doubt. I've been, trying to plant food plots my entire whitetail hunting career, which is a little shorter than yours. But the minute that I started, or that I realized that I could get Deer Grow back into some of these remote plots where I couldn't get lime or fertilizer, especially in the 50-pound bag, format. Mm-hmm. So everything was changed. I could get into these spots moving forward with a backpack sprayer, and that's since escalated to these 40 or 60 gallon sprayers, and we're doing upwards of 5 to 10 acre food plots just with Deer Grow and having phenomenal success.
Yeah, and I mean, with the price of fertilizer, lime, diesel, everything this year, I mean, what better way to get in there and grow a successful food plot at about a third of the cost? Check out Deer Grow at deergrow.com. And we're back.
Good morning.
HUNTR Podcast, episode 68.
Good morning.
Good morning, Vietnam. Episode 68. Chugging right along.
How y'all doing?
Just quick math, 32 away from 100.
Yeah.
Seems like nothing.
Yeah. Hey, we're just going to keep going.
By the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of the year. It is, I don't have my watch, March something.
17th.
17th.
Yeah.
How about that? In the middle of March at this point. Progressing. Progressing.
My little sister is 26 years old now.
Yeah,
isn't that crazy?
I think mine turns 30 this year. My little sister turns 30 this year.
And yours has kids, which is even weirder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bizarre.
Yeah, age, man.
Dude, my sister's running a pharmacy. Do you know she's in charge of the pharmacy?
No.
She's been a pharmacist for like 2-3 years.
Wow.
And they're like, do you want to run? It's CVS. I think they're just,
she's in Georgia, right?
Not that she's not qualified, but they're understaffed. And
sure.
So, they need pharmacists. And so they've got her firing people and stuff.
It's a good job.
Yeah, it's a great job.
Makes good money.
Yeah, she's down in Alabama.
Oh, Alabama.
Yeah, just because her husband's in the helicopter.
Oh, that's right.
Yep.
Navy or Air Force?
Army.
Army.
But I think they'll be back because he has to just report like once or twice a month to Wheeling. So they'll be back in the area, maybe like Maryland or something.
That's cool.
But he's been sending us some videos of flying a chopper, which is pretty cool.
Very nice.
Like when you're ready to fly me to the freaking Yukon or whatever, like we're ready to go.
Just drop us in.
We're ready to go.
Just drop us in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's mid-March. Today's the first day of the NCAA basketball tournament.
Oh, been waiting for that.
A little March Madness, huh? Yeah, I know, right?
Pumpkin pushers out there.
So you got that.
Fall wrestling like a real sport.
Yeah. What else is this weekend is NCAA wrestling tournament.
There you go.
So national championship. And then it's mid-March. So progressing, man.
It's flying.
It's
oh, dude.
Yeah.
If you haven't already, we got to put in for North Dakota point.
Yep.
Utah is still open for
Kansas
another week or so
weeks.
for a point. Apparently, I bought my Utah tag.
You did?
Well, my permit. My application. And then I forgot, and I didn't have they didn't send me a receipt or anything. So I had to call the State Department and be like, hey, it's saying I'm ineligible for another point.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, you already bought it. I was like, okay, cool.
You banned trail cameras, and now you won't let me buy my damn point?
Banned Jared Pasha? Come on.
We heard your podcast. You're banned.
Also, one more thing, just because, we need more time to catch up here, but I told you I wrote South Cox about
Yep.
So, and I don't know if that'll end up working out. I don't think South checks his Instagram DMs.
He's active on it.
Or maybe he's just not responding to me for some reason. But
that's possible.
Well, whatever. But, to all the guys that have challenged us to what if you could only hunt the rut dirt, with a recurve,
Yeah.
Because we're always talking crap on crossbows. So it's understandable. It's a fair argument.
Fair argument.
So I'm checking it out. I'm checking it out.
Well, yeah, I mean, you were talking to my dad this morning. I mean, that's how I started, was on recurves.
Well, your dad was shooting fingers till 6 years ago.
On a compound.
yeah. But he had like a prime. It was a prime rise fingers.
He was shooting a wooden bear whitetail compound bow with camo duct tape on it.
Yeah, that's what you were saying.
With fingers until like 6 or 7 years ago.
How funny.
And then then he went to prime, and then he went to Hoyt.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hilarious. But I mean, it's if you're gonna do it, you gotta do it soon, because like, man, before we know it, like I laid out this weekend was kind of my all right. Let's think about active things I need to do here in March, April, May, and then I look at my list and I'm like, shit, that's a lot.
Yep.
We started yesterday just going out to the Ohio farm and checking out the cabin and things. That's not even on my list, but those are things like I need to do to get the deer camp ready. And then it's like, okay, here's my planning strategy. And so like, I'm already processing in my head, like, I got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
One check off so far, which is they opened up the food plot behind the house. I got to clean it up a little bit, but they did a great job.
Nice.
And then I need one more day of cutting before I can get ready to plant all the trees that come in April. And then
what are you cutting?
Just cutting trees, TSI.
In Ohio?
No, in PA.
At the house.
Mm-hmm.
And you're planting pines at your house and in PA. I'm sorry, at your house and Ohio.
No, I'm not planting anything in Ohio this year.
Gotcha.
Yep. No, this year in Ohio I'm just going to go in and drop 8 to 10 acres of food.
Cool.
And then just
it's a lot of food.
See what happens.
A ton of food.
Yeah. It's a lot. It was kind of cool to get there, because last time I was there it was snowy and just kind of nasty. I was only there for an hour. We were walking through some of those bottoms, and I mean, that property's thick.
Mm-hmm.
It's thick.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, all the hills funneling down into this bottom are thick.
That's what it takes.
So we'll see. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of deer sign. It just, I'm sure that if I put food down in these bottoms, I'm going to have to whack 40 does.
You think the wind's going to be an interesting challenge on that property?
No, I actually think it's going to be really nice, because all access is coming east to west.
I guess I'm asking more because of terrain. I know how my farm's extremely difficult.
The ridges will be because of the way it's a big bowl, and so you've got these big ridges on each side.
And it's an eastern facing bowl?
It's a western facing bowl. So it flows east to west.
Like if you're prevailing winds coming out of the west,
I'm walking right into it.
Coming over the center of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Straight
See,
through.
I've got a really nice bowl like that a bunch of deer like to bed in our place, but it's opposite, and so it just screws us. Let's call that bowl like a half moon.
Mm-hmm.
Anywhere on the
that wind hits
prevailing wind side of it, it just loops all the way up.
This one's coming up over the ridge and down through, and I'm accessing through.
Is there a saddle at the top of it?
Yep.
Always is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of those ridges are insane. So, I'm trying to like baby step it this year. Of like, I need to do a lot of work to the camp house and then drop food, and like, that's it. Like, just see what happens. Figured out my AT&T cameras get good service in the bottoms, so I just need to swap all my Verizons for AT&Ts and on that farm.
Beautiful.
Men should be good to go.
Dude, Dad was out last night scouting for that youth turkey hunt we have coming up, and so Jed gave Dad permission to take.
Yep.
So there's properties that I deer hunt as well will be included in this turkey hunt, and he said it was a 3-year-old, so 2 or 3-year-old, still holding both sides.
Really? Mm-hmm. We didn't see any. I did see a set of
last night.
I did see a set of footprints on our on the trail on that property. So somebody was in there shed hunting
at Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Mm-hmm. On your property?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Came through probably on the public side and down in.
Dude, who was telling us about this? Said like the most terrifying no trespassing sign said something like, no trespassing, me shoot you with scattergun.
Yeah, that sounds like my feeling when I saw like the footprint. I was just like,
it's infuriating.
Mm-hmm. So
coming off of public.
Yeah, I haven't put up, like there are posted signs, but they're old. Like I haven't put up any new ones. So I'll go in and put some new ones up here in the next few weeks, just run the whole property line. But, it doesn't bother me right now.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, because I mean, that dude had to walk a pretty far way to get in there.
Yeah, I respect it.
I kind of do respect it.
You're kind of done the same thing.
Off my property.
Yeah.
So, anyways, episode 68 today, we've got Brian Murphy. So many of you may know Brian as the former CEO of QDMA, or Deer Management Association, currently in charge of business development for HuntStand. And Brian's a wildlife biologist. He's been, working with deer and that sector for, 30 some years, as he just told us. And so Brian and I have known each other, since I got out of my undergrad, probably. I don't even know what that is, 15, almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And just our involvement in QDMA and stuff through research projects and things like that. So yeah, so happy to get Brian on. And, I know a lot of people have talked about QDMA on here, some positive, some not. And so I think it'll be an interesting discussion as we kind of dive in and really, walk through, what QDMA did and, was it for the better or for the worse type of thing.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I'm sure, Brian should be able to give us some interesting perspective. So obviously on the QDM side of things, he's advocating for, that type of approach. But it sounds like he's, also open to the fact that that's not for everybody,
Correct.
As are we.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Want to bring him in? All right. There he is. Hey, man.
Good morning.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the HUNTR Podcast, Brian. The Jared and I were kind of just talking mainly about our kind of pre-podcast discussion there. And, I think one of the interesting things about you and I have known each other for, almost 20 years now.
That's right.
Which I don't know if that's scarier for me or scarier for you. But, I think what's interesting about it is, much like the hunting industry, our biologist community is very small and tight. And it's even though like we all, you look at you at HuntStand and what I'm doing with Stone Road and Hunter and stuff now, like there's very few of us that kind of divert out of, call it the standard pathway, which is typically state agencies, right? That's where most people coming through the biology side of things from a bachelor's into a master's end up in a state agency. And then you've got a few of us outliers who kind of just, that's not our path. And I think what's kind of neat about that is people probably look at guys like you and I, and they don't even relate us as a biologist necessarily, because they're just like, well, he doesn't work for the state, so he's not a biologist. Where in reality, there's a lot of, people in the private sector that are biologists and have the same education and sometimes more experience than people that are in the state agency side.
No doubt about it. There's so many paths that a biologist can take, and I've seen just about every number of them, including those that stay true to state agency or federal agency work, but consultants, those that work in the hunting industry that just start as in the biological sciences to kind of branch out, hunting guides, ranch managers. There's just a sundry of places, environmental consultants. I've seen so many different pathways, and that's what's unique about our industry. And there are a lot of opportunities, but you really have to be hungry. You have to really want it, because it's a very crowded field. There's thousands of students coming through the programs every year across this country. And, I would venture a guess that less than half of them do end up in the wildlife profession somewhere. Many of them end up completely different pathways, because it's really got to be in your soul. You've got to really want it, just like any other profession. It's got to be part of who you are, and the only path in life you can take is doing something with wildlife. Mm-hmm. And that was my path as a young child.
So, Brian, tell us, or tell the listeners too, a little bit about yourself, kind of your pathway into kind of where you are today.
Absolutely. I would consider myself an old school, classically trained deer biologist. I guess that's the best way to describe me. But, growing up as a young child, I grew up in northeast Oklahoma, foothills of the Ozark Mountains, hunting, fishing, and trapping. And that was my identity as a young child. Lived in rural America and enjoyed hunting and fishing. My father, however, was not a hunter. He was an avid shooter. And so he handed me the rifle and said, learn on your own, which I was happy to do. And thankfully, I eventually found a mentor. But, it was a very stark moment in my life. As a young child, I saw my first white-tailed deer at age 10. And where I grew up, there were not many white-tailed deer. These were things I read about in magazines, fur fishing, game, outdoor life. There wasn't many places for that kind of information back in the day. And I remember vividly finding my first whitetail track as a 10-year-old on a dirt road down to my neighbor's. I was going down to fish in his pond. He lived about a mile from me. And pedaling on my bike, I found a deer track, or at least what I thought was a deer track. And so I hurried home and grabbed my father, and we jumped in his pickup truck and drove down there. And he said, "Lo and behold, son, you have found a deer track." And I was like, "Wow, they do exist." About a year later, I was out with 22 in hand, just hiking the hills, shooting whatever young boys can shoot back in the day, and ran face to face to a doe on a trail, and it changed my life. And a year later, I was reading about a deer biologist in Outdoor Life magazine at age 12 in the late 70s. And I did what all 12-year-olds do. I convened a meeting with my parents, and I told them I have decided what I am going to be in life. And they said, "What's that, son?" And I said, "I'm going to be a wildlife biologist, and I'm going to study deer." And they looked at me with this quizzical look and said, "Is that a real job, and does it actually pay money?" And I spent the next 40 plus years trying to answer those questions. But it led me down a path that I can only say is a boy's dream. My family eventually moved to Texas. Did an undergraduate in wildlife management at Texas Tech University. And at that time, I didn't realize it, but looking back, it was a very opportune time because the concept of quality deer management was relatively new, but starting to get ingrained in Texas in the 80s due to Al Brothers, who started the whole movement in the 70s. And I had the opportunity to work on a number of ranches as an undergraduate that were doing some pioneer management work, some of the earliest helicopter deer work ever done. I was fortunate enough to be part of chasing deer with helicopters and net guns and drive nets and things that we now take for granted. All that was pioneered in the 80s in South Texas. And so I was part of all that. And that got my foot in the door eventually at the University of Georgia for a master's degree under Dr. Carl Miller and Dr. Larry Marchand, two of the well-known deer gurus of their time. And, didn't even finish my graduate work there. And they hired me on as a wildlife research coordinator, a deer research coordinator for the university. I got my hands in all kinds of cool research for a couple of years, vision research, scent communication, behavior, just at a sundry of different topics. So I was just very fortunate. Then I had a very unique opportunity to go 12,000 miles away and become Australia's first ever deer biologist. And so my wife and I packed our bags and went down under for 4 years. And I got to spearhead a deer management program for Australia, which was just a life-changing opportunity for me. And fallow deer, they have 6 species of deer in Australia, but I was mostly managing fallow deer. And when that ended, I came back to the U.S. and was immediately approached by the then board of directors of the Quality Deer Management Association and asked to take over that organization, and jumped in with both feet. And it wasn't much of an organization, frankly, at the time. It was an idea that our founder, Joe Hamilton, had held together. And when they handed over the reins to me, it sounded great. I was going to be the executive director, but I had no staff, no budgets, no real plan. They handed me the organization, which literally fit in the back of Joe Hamilton's El Camino, which he drove to my house and dumped off with $142 in the national account and said, "We're behind you all the way. Go get them." And so we moved the national office of the QDMA into my upstairs bedroom. And we ran that for about 6 months out of that, and finally started to build the basis of an organization that, eventually became, in my opinion, at least a fairly monumental organization in shifting the paradigm of deer management across, certainly North America and many other parts of the world as well. So, and for the last couple of years, I've worked for HuntStand, the largest hunting and land management app in the world, certainly in the U.S., with over 2 million users. So it's allowed me to continue my relationship of connecting hunters with the land, with the resource, and doing it in an efficient way that hopefully also adds to recruitment and retention of hunters. My whole life's been dedicated to deer and deer hunting, and certainly at this stage of my life, that's all I care to do. So very fortunate to have, unlimited opportunities my whole life. So no one can ever feel sorry for this guy. Had a good run.
That's awesome, man. And I think what's interesting about it, if you kind of look at that whole journey, like it seems very much a wide variety, but in all reality, it's a very narrow niche. I mean, I remember sitting in, I think it was my undergrad, consulting professor's office, and he basically told me that I was one of the most stubborn people he ever met because I said, well, all I want to do is work with deer, and he's like, well, you have to realize, like, of the amount of wildlife jobs out there, the amount of wildlife jobs related to deer is this, it's tiny. And it's like, well, cool. Like, but that's all I care. Like, that's what I want to do, and so, and it wasn't that I didn't care about grouse or turkeys or anything else. Like, I loved hunting and being out there. It's just, if I saw a career pathway moving forward, it was like, no, this is what I want to work with. And, I think it ends up, bringing together so many competitive, students from across the country every year that, hopefully it pushes those ones who really want it, who truly could make a difference in the long term, to be the ones who get those positions and succeed. That's not always the case, because, some universities favor certain criteria over others. But, ultimately, I think you are seeing more and more people try to make a difference in that passion. And they have a passion for deer usually before they get behind that thing. It's not like, oh, I just ended up in deer. No, that is the most demanded sector of research.
No doubt, and has been for 30 or 40 years, although we're seeing a shift now. Now, a majority of wildlife undergraduate students are females, often from urban areas. No disrespect to them. Many of them are deer lovers too, but we're seeing a shift in the composition of wildlife students, largely driven ultimately by funding.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, there's not as much deer research money out there for students, and research money funds research programs at academic institutions, and therefore the students that they can bring on board. So it's getting more challenging for someone to be a pure deer biologist, just because of their academic training pathways. So I would say it's even more challenging today than it was, 30 years ago when I entered the profession. So somebody that's just, in their teens or 20s entering that space now has to want it, tremendously. But opportunities. I meet young people all the time that call me, ask me for guidance, whatever questions, and there are still people out there making it through this gauntlet and coming out as deer people, if you will.
Yep.
So it still exists, but like I said early, any profession, you have to want it more than everybody else in your group, and be persistent.
Yeah, I think it is crazy that, and I remember having the same conversation when I was in my graduate school, but we had, in fact, I think one of the Southeast Deer Study groups, which if people aren't familiar with that, it's basically a gathering of universities, agencies, organizations, all to discuss deer research throughout the Southeast, and happens every year. It's an awesome event. It was like one of our highlight events when we were in graduate school. And I think one of the topics when I was there was talking about the fading, what we call hook and bullet student, right? Which is, the people who enter a wildlife graduate program or a wildlife undergraduate program and love to hunt and fish, which, if you're listening to this, you'll probably think, well, yeah, that's an obvious. But Brian, per what you're saying, it's not. Most of these people that are coming into this sector are more non-consumptive users than they are consumptive users. And that tends to, start to have people a little bit worried about the way that some of these state agencies and resources are managed, because you potentially have people coming into positions and roles to where they're not a consumptive user, they're a non-consumptive user, they're a conservation biologist type.
No doubt. In fact, we're at a point now that most of the major, what I would consider, wildlife institutions around the country are having to teach hunting to their wildlife students, which is just a foreign concept to me, because when I entered the profession, we were all hook and bullet types. We all came from mostly rural America, where we hunted, fished, and trapped. So we didn't have to understand where hunting fit into the global picture of conservation. That doesn't come ingrained in many students today. So most of the, big universities around the country now have not only, where hunting plays a role in conservation courses for their students, but also the R3 movement, the recruitment, retention, reactivation of hunters, is actually targeted at future wildlife professionals. They're actually taking these future wildlife professionals out on their first hunts as, 20-something-year-old students that are in the profession. So thankfully, the research shows that once they're indoctrinated and understand where hunting fits in, they're certainly pro-hunting. They may not be active hunters.
Sure.
But certainly there's certainly as you said, a changing guard as to who will eventually lead our wildlife agencies. Many of them did not grow up under what I would call a traditional wildlife pathway.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that you said that was interesting, Brian, and kind of tying into that, and Jared and I have had this conversation, I don't know, probably in the last 3 to 6 podcasts, but is around R3 and the number of hunters that we're seeing in the kind of call it the post-COVID era or COVID era, if you want to say we're still in it. And I think what's interesting is, for us is, we see recent numbers coming out of like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are saying, we've actually increased in hunters in many states, especially over the last 15 years. And so we're at a point now where, just us as hunters, especially if you look at 2020 and 2021, you go to some of these public lands in the Midwest or in the South, and it's like, man, there's guys everywhere. And it comes to a point where like you never want to say, well, we're flush with hunters, but at what point do we maybe have to start treating this thing a little bit different than what I think we have been doing for 20 years, which is get every hunter we can, recruit every hunter we can, retain every hunter we can. If they stopped hunting, get them back into hunting type of thing.
Yeah, so we've got sort of two confluences of things coming together. One is just a general longer term decline in hunter participation based on just how we're changing, how we grow up as young people. Most people today in our country are 1, 2, 3, or 4 generations removed from hunting and living in rural landscapes. So just the tradition starts to break down in that pathway. We're also losing habitat at an alarming rate. So we're seeing a shrinking area of huntable land, even for white-tailed deer, the most adaptable species we have. If you look at 10-year snapshots of urbanization across any state in America, you see it. So we're seeing a loss of habitat while we're trying to recruit more hunters into a shrinking space. And so that will cause increased crowding. We've also seen not only a COVID bump, but we've also seen with apps such as ours, HuntStand, increased availability of knowledge of where you can hunt and how you can access those areas. And we see that now with people doing some incredible planning and detailed work to get into those nooks and crannies of public land that for many years hadn't been hunted very much.
Mm-hmm.
You have the tools to find them easily unless you were a local. Now you can pick a spot at 3 states from your home and do all that homework at your house and go in and find those hidden spots pretty easily with the technology that we have today. So yeah, we are seeing an increased use of public lands as long as they're reasonable quality public lands. At the same time, we're seeing some pulses. Certainly, HuntStand, we enjoyed a huge bump during COVID. More people got back out and hunted and fished. But we saw a similar bump back in the Great Recession, and a lot of people don't remember those days. 08, 09, early 2010, we had a huge bump in hunter participation there when people were out of work. When people don't have 9-to-5 jobs to go to, whether it's because of recession or COVID, we see a return to these outdoor pastimes.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting. I followed this hunter decline trend for decades. In fact, we saw it coming. I mean, this was not new to any of us that had been tracking this stuff for a long time. But it might come to some surprise that the number one variable most correlated with hunter participation in America is housing starts. So, in other words, as people get more and more engaged in building homes as a roaring economy, we see a decrease in hunter participation. Some of Mark Duda's research at Responsive Management has shown that. So most people would look at income, access, age, all these other variables as most correlated, but it really comes down to the most tightly fit to the model is housing starts.
Interesting.
So there's some big trends out there for sure.
Yeah, and I think what we hear from a lot, and this maybe starts to tie into the QDMA side a little bit, is for a while there were certain states that kind of were, let's say, your go-tos, especially if you're a non-resident. You and it still is a little bit today, but the Illinois, the Iowas, the Kansas. But it seemed like for a long time, maybe the community itself was very opportunistic in the hunting style, right? It wasn't, let's say in the 90s and stuff, people weren't just saying, well, I'm going to, as a majority or as a large group saying, I'm going to go out and try to kill mature bucks in all these different states, right? And I think that, if you look at that compared to where it is now, I would say that maybe it's not the overwhelming majority, but there is a large percentage of hunters who that is their goal, and at least if it's not their goal to go to multiple states and kill a mature buck, it for sure is their goal in their home state where they are hunting is to kill, a bigger buck than they would have killed in the 90s for, on that comparison. And I think that if you look at kind of where QDMA came in, it was, you guys necessarily didn't come in and say, we're here to make sure that you guys have big bucks, right? That wasn't necessarily the point. And I think that a lot of the people, even today, who are still kind of, on the side of QDMA was a bad thing, thought that that was your goal, right? Your goal was to come in and say, we're going to make sure that there's just big bucks in this state, period.
Right. No, it was certainly came from a different perspective, although it got misconstrued by many. If in many, younger hunters may not even sort of realize where we came from back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And so, if you picture a period in our country in the 70s, for example, when we just kind of finished the restocking era, deer were depleted across America. So from the 30s to the 70s, largely we moved deer from where they existed to where they didn't. And we had a protectionism philosophy. We had to protect our does because our deer herds were burgeoning. Just as I mentioned, as a young child in Oklahoma, I didn't even see a deer where I lived. And now that county produces the highest deer kill in the state of Oklahoma, some decades later. And so and that was the right prescription for the time. We had to buck only hunting. We had to protect our does because our herds were so low. And I don't think that our biologists of the day would have ever imagined the period that we experienced during the late 80s to the early 2000s where we had too many deer. They were out of control. Places like Pennsylvania, but you pick almost any state within reason, you see the same pattern of deer herds growing almost exponentially. They hit a point in the growth cycle we call the inflection point, where you almost can't control the growth from that point forward, and they did that. So we saw rapidly expanding deer herds. We saw incredible habitat damage for the first time due to deer. We saw bucks getting just completely exploited because we had the highest hunter numbers back in the 70s and 80s relative to the number of deer we had. So we had the ability. Places like Pennsylvania, for example, as you well know, Jeremy, growing up there,
yep.
They drop off 90% of the bucks in a couple of days of opening day when the pumpkin army came out.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't kill, quote, your buck by the second day of the season, your odds of even getting a buck were almost gone.
Right.
And your chance of shooting a buck 2.5 and older were slim to start with and got slimmer by the second day. So we saw these, very young buck age structures, very high deer densities, a lot of imbalance in the breeding chronology, the rut, if you will. We had strung out ruts, strung out fawning crops. We needed a solution. And quality deer management was this whole herd management philosophy that we put at least equal pressure on the doe side of the equation to balance that deer herd density wise with the habitat. We tried to balance up the sex ratio to get the deer herd functioning more normal. And a byproduct of that is passing some of those 1.5, perhaps 2.5-year-old bucks and getting some semblance of mature bucks back in the population for population health reasons. Byproduct is an older buck. And that's that. But that was not the goal. That was a byproduct of the general prescription that we needed for our deer herds. And so, I was very fortunate, I guess, in a lot of ways. I got a lot of scars to prove it. I guess fortunate would be a qualifier. But, I was part of those deer war days where, hunters across America were in arms over quality deer management. We had obviously the advocates, we had the detractors. Places like Pennsylvania, again, were ground zero for a lot of these wars that we saw. And, a lot of my colleagues have tremendous battle scars from those days, people like Gary Alt and many others who are friends that we stood with, frankly, during those times. But now looking back on it, today, for example, we enjoy this past year, at least the 2020 hunting season. We saw the highest percentage of adult bucks in the harvest ever recorded. We saw the lowest percentage of 1.5-year-old bucks in the harvest ever recorded. And yet we still had a near record buck harvest. So, we're not like we're shooting no bucks, but they're all older. Now we're shooting as many bucks as we've ever shot, and the highest percentage of those, 39%, are 3.5 and older.
Wow.
40% of hunters in America in 2020 took a buck, which is incredible. 40% success rate across a country as big as ours, and 39% of those were 3.5 and older. That's pretty incredible, and pretty incredible change. When you look back 20 years,
yeah,
we're seeing 70% plus 1.5-year-old bucks in the harvest.
Yeah. No, that's
so it's big change.
How did you? What I'm curious, Brian, is like obviously you mentioned Gary All. What was the process for some of these states? Because each agency is set up a little bit differently, but to adopt this way of thinking, I guess, is the best way to say it.
Well, I would argue that in most cases, and I'm friends with the vast majority of deer biologists in the country. I would say in most cases, it was not the agencies that were the leaders of this. It was hunters on the ground. It was true uprising of hunters saying, we want something different than what we have now. And we expect our agency to help us get to this new place. And so obviously in any paradigm shift, you have these early adopters, whether it be states or individuals. So the philosophy came out of Texas, which immediately put a stigma on it that it's only a Texas thing, because Texas is very different. And so our founder, Joe Hamilton, took the concept to the Southeast and South Carolina, never intended for it to be a social movement or even an organization. It was just a strategy that he felt would help himself and another colleague, two biologists that managed about 1,000 hunting clubs in the lower coastal plain of South Carolina, the low country. And they just wanted a philosophy that would help them there. And so they implemented this philosophy with these clubs. The word started to get out, so they formed a small group called the South Carolina Quality Deer Management Association, thinking it would just be a state organization. Soon the interest started to come from other states. It expanded into the North American Quality Deer Management Association, and then ultimately just to the Quality Deer Management Association, and became a national, and in some cases international organization. And that's kind of when I stepped in and started to lead that organization.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Hoyt Archery.
Dude, where would we be without our Hoyt bows?
Probably shooting crossbows.
or a Matthews, yeah.
One and the same.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, we love being Hoyt guys because you stand out. When you're in this room full of other people that shoot these other types of bows, I feel like the Hoyt guys just stick out.
Dude, it's just a legit bow. I mean, especially that carbon riser, man. I mean, I know that they've got several other aluminum lines as well, but for me, I'm shooting that RX5 in the carbon model. They've since come out with the RX7, and I can't tell you how much I love being a Hoyt guy amongst a sea full of Matthews guys. So we're out there, I think, proving them wrong, shooting 80 pounds and, killing stuff.
Hey, man, if you want to get serious, get Hoyt.
Brian, what did that philosophy entail? What would have been the core pillars of QDM in the early days to say, hey guys, we realize that there's a call for change here. Here are the things we're going to do differently out of the gate.
Yeah, probably the biggest change in the early days was shifting of anti-doe harvest to aggressive doe harvests, because that was the biggest challenge in trying to get a hunter who had grown up under the philosophy of you don't shoot any of the mothers of next year's bucks. That's a tough one to overcome, and it was ingrained in a lot of older hunters that grew up during the 60s and 70s and early 80s when we didn't have many deer, and it just made sense. It made sense. Why would you shoot the mothers of next year's bucks? And it was hard for them to understand the biology of managing sex ratios and age structures and that sort of thing. So that was the biggest initial cultural change. Getting a hunter to pass a legal buck, that was a big change for many hunters. Why would you pass any buck that was a legal buck in a state? Why would you voluntarily pass a 6-point, year-and-a-half-old buck when you could take him? Because there's always this belief, if I don't take him, the next guy over the hill will.
Yep.
And that philosophy, that argument still stays today. But my counter to that has always been, if you take him, it's 100% chance he will not make it to next year if you give him the doubt. And what we found pretty quickly, and I had the good fortune of working with hundreds of properties over my career. And more than one occasion, I got a chance to talk to the neighbors that they were pointing at, saying, those guys will never do it over there. More than once, I got to go over and talk to those guys, and they were pointing back the other way, saying, we would do it, but they, so it took communication, it took building trust. And I think for the first time, hunters had to realize that managing deer was not what they did on their property or their piece of public ground. It was what everybody around them were doing collectively as a unit, because deer are so mobile. And so it took this concept of kind of a neighborhood approach, a co-op, if you will. And that's what really started to gain the traction. And then it started to move to states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, where we had very small property ownerships. The average hunter in those states may hunt an 80, a 160, unlike the Southeast, which is larger tracts of land in general. And so once people started to see that it could work in Michigan, then it started to start those spot fires. And I look at it much like, I do a lot of prescribed burning, and you start a drip torch and you start a line of fire and it all burns together. That's what was happening. We just saw this societal drip torch effect across America where hunters started to challenge their own states and say, hey, we want what they're doing in pick a state. And before we knew it now, I think the vast majority of states have some degree of antler restriction or buck harvest program in place now because of all of those years of sort of uprising and upswell of public interest.
Good. Yeah, I'll go one more. I would assume, Brian, from the position that you've been in, you've been involved in like the startup or, maybe getting some of these co-ops to the next level or improving neighborhoods by encouraging discussions and stuff. I know that myself personally, I believe Jeremy's had some experiences as well, like, talking with neighbors and trying to get people on the same page. And like, I think that a lot of people, like you said, are very open, very receptive to that. They're like, yeah, that would, we're in, we'd like to do that as well. And great, here's all these trail camera pictures, here's these deer. And I've just been personally like really discouraged with the outcome of, and this is tied to like the same methodology or reason that we have like antler restrictions and not age restrictions, is because there's a capability of hunters or an education level that's like, it takes time. There's a running of trail cameras, there's a studying of the animals, there's an understanding of like basic biology of what these things look like. That's just kind of left me dissatisfied with the result, and that all the bucks that we said we weren't going to shoot got shot. Multiple years in a row.
Certainly, there's the main limitations to any management program that's focused. At least one of the focuses is increasing the older bucks in the population. Requires not only patience and a willingness of hunters to stay off the trigger finger, but truly an education in aging deer on the hoof. Making those kind of calls consistently and accurately in the field, and that doesn't just come overnight.
Yeah.
And so there are going to be fits and starts and mistakes. The only way that I've seen to overcome that is just stay the course. Not chastise anybody, and not believe that just because you're able to, separate a 3-year-old from a 4-year-old easily that they can, and that they're going to make some mistakes. But, try to be positive in your reinforcement of, hey, let's go back and look at those trail cameras. What were you seeing when you shot this deer? Look, here's what I saw, and just try to use it as a teaching moment, not as a, chastising moment. Because they don't have to the neighbors don't have to follow anything you do.
Sure.
So really, it's based on trust and cooperation, and those things take time, take persistence, but they also take some education. So anything you can do to up their game, provide them resources, provide them videos on aging deer. Let's share cameras, and I'll tell you what I think the age is. All the things you can do to sort of subtly allow them to increase their skill set.
Yeah, you're 100% right, Brian. And I'm just chuckling at the thought of somebody shooting a 2-year-old, that I had sent them pictures of, and then me shortly after sending them a video on how to age deer.
Yeah.
And Brian, I've personally had a really a good learning opportunity in our own, call it our camp. So like in Ohio, my folks own a piece of ground, and so it gets hunted. I mean, it's a good chunk of ground. It's almost 1,000 acres. A lot of it is old pasture ground, and so it probably hunts like 300 or 400 to start with. And we've got like 6 guys that hunt it. It's my dad, myself, my uncle, who's a big inspiration for the way that I bow hunt, one of his good friends, and one of my dad's best friends, and one of my good friends. And so we've got 6 people that hunt this thing, not every day. A lot of us are out of state, and but there's pressure there, and there's definitely neighboring pressure too. And we have some very diverse age groups within our hunting group, and definitely ideas. One of our guys is in his 60s from the UP of Michigan, and his mindset is like completely different from mine, which is introduced to quote unquote trophy hunting or quality deer management very early on. And so, I mean, dude, we've butted heads like no other, and it's taken some serious prioritizing of our relationships over deer hunting, and also just what's the word, like give and take, essentially making sacrifices to say
conceding certain things back and forth,
conceding to get there. And I forget exactly the point that I was trying to make with that, but it's definitely challenging. Like you said, I can say this, Brian. So the instance that happened was this guy, he's a good friend of mine, his name's Willie, has, I think, struggled with the idea, not just of like, hey, of holding out for an older class mature, which was not necessarily something he wanted to do out of the gate. He was happy to continue shooting these bucks. And, but he was willing to say, hey, I'll try. And it's funny, you know, he, more than anybody else in our group, was extremely resistant to any kind of correction on an animal that was taken. You know, and so like, as you're saying, I obviously it should be positive reinforcement. Hey, that's a great buck. You made a good shot. You know, there's good things that have come out of this. It's not a wasted experience at all, you know, but, you know, I know your goal was this, you know, and I know that this was not necessarily in line with that. So like, here's, not to push this on you, but here's maybe, let's look at some more trail camera pictures. Let's look at these. Let's educate ourselves, like you said. And man, he had a tough time, like even being open to the idea of saying that something was not right. Like if I shot a buck that I wasn't the one that I sent out to shoot, if I set a goal for myself to shoot a 4.5-year-old buck and I shot a 3.5-year-old buck, I think it's okay to be disappointed with that result. Like, not that it should take away from that animal, and it's deserving of respect, obviously. But it's okay, I think, to say, man, that's not what I intended to do. You know, I didn't meet my goal in that regard. And so we really struggled to see eye to eye on even it being okay to have that conversation. We've since come a long way, but curious on your take on that.
Well, a good friend of mine many years ago wrote an article in the Quality Whitetails magazine that it's a one-pager. It's very deep and profound. He's a little bit of a philosopher. And take-home message from the article was, you know, quality deer management or any management regime you choose will work if the heart is right. If the intent is pure to learn and to try to do better. And I use this all the time because, you know, we get a lot of consternation from hunters that mistakenly shoot button bucks, for example, and some of them get chastised, fined. I've even seen hunters get kicked off of properties because of this. And to me, I think that's an overreaction, unless they're that person that just shoots 3 every year, no matter what, you know. Sure. There's certain, well, you got to put a little teeth in it. But, you know, if they're out there for the right reasons, trying to do right and have a history more or less of moving forward in their educational process, you know, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Worst thing we can do is chastise a newer beginning hunter that makes a mistake, an honest mistake, and shoots that 2.5-year-old prize 10-pointer that you're trying to protect. Because, you know, we as a fraternity, I think, owe it to the resource and the future of hunting that, you know, we're not perfect. Heck, I still occasionally shoot a button buck myself, and I've written the charts in the books and taught the courses. It can happen. You know, I occasionally misjudge an animal on the hoof. It happens. So again, I just think that, you know, we need to be as flexible as we can while still moving forward towards a management goal. And, you know, in anything we do in life, we set goals for ourselves. Deer management is no different. You know, I'm an avid runner now, and I have certain goals of times and distance and that sort of thing. And if I don't hit my goal, I'm a little disappointed, but I still made progress. I still got healthier that day with the run. And so that's how I look at it. You know, it's okay to be a little disappointed if it's a learning experience, as long as we don't look down on that animal, because we still took the life of a beautiful animal, and we ought to be proud of that opportunity that we have in this country to even have the privilege of hunting whitetails. Yeah,
it's sensitive. I get it, because the life of an animal of any age is a valuable thing and needs to be, you know, treated with respect. And so I'm even conflicted internally to say anything, or even think to myself, like, you know, that didn't match my management goals or whatever. You know, there's a...
Well, and I think even going back to, like, you know, before, let's even say QDM was a thing, and looking at that, like, it's hard for me to take myself back when I started hunting, and I was purely a tag puncher. I mean, that's my goal when I stepped out in the woods for deer hunting, was to punch that tag. That was the ultimate goal. And I look at it now, and maybe it's I'm older, I'm wiser, but I look back now, and it's like, there's, like, you know, I enjoy watching 50 deer walk by me and never even picking up my bow, just because I'm like, that's the experience. That's why I'm hunting. It's not necessarily to even shoot the target buck I'm after. It's just to be out there and enjoy it. And so I think it's a sensitive thing. And another example, you brought up the button bucks, like, as a dad, like, one of the things that I've run into, and Brian, maybe you have too, is like, Carter, my oldest, and I were sitting in the blind this year. during bow season, and a button buck comes out in the plot, and I was like, he's shot 1 4-point in his life, and I'm like, man, whenever you're ready, take it. And he's like, is that a button buck? And I said, yeah. He's like, well, I don't want to shoot it. And like, I was kind of proud of him that he was passing it, but I'm also like, what have I done to this kid? Because at his age, I would have mowed that thing, in a heartbeat. And so it's a weird kind of struggle there, because I'm like, well, man, that's awesome. Like, I'm glad, next year he'll be a 1.5-year-old buck, and you can shoot him then if you want. But I'm also like, why doesn't he want to shoot that button buck?
Let me piggyback on that too. Dude, Jed's kid is the same way. Bizarrely, he's like 10 years old, and he's passing 3-year-olds easy. Like, they're 10 yards from him in the blind. He's got a crossbow, and he's like, it's not big enough. And Jed's getting worried because it's been like 2 years now, and he's like, some of these 4 or 5-year-old bucks, they just haven't stepped in front, and like, he's kind of losing interest, and like, he's just not interested in these 140-inch 3-year-olds.
Yeah.
Because he sees what dad shoots, I guess. And
that's a conundrum. I mean, both of my daughters hunt, and both of them grew up sitting in the stand with me from very young and watching, dozens of 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks a year, walking around us. We're blessed where we hunt. And when both of them were ready to shoot their first buck, I told them, you can shoot whatever you want. If it's a spike, if it's a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, I don't care. And both of them, independent of each other in different situations, said, I don't want to shoot a 1.5-year-old buck.
Yeah.
Year-old that comes by, which was fine. And our management goal on this farm is 4-year-olds and above. So, a 2-year-old would not normally be on our hit list, but we were perfectly fine with them taking a 2-year-old buck. And that's what both of them ended up taking for their first deer. And it was funny though, a year or two later, I was hunting with my oldest daughter with crossbow for the first time. And we had a doe and a 4-pointer come out, and she said, I'm going to shoot the doe. And I was like, yeah, whatever you want to do. And so she shot and missed. She was all down in the dumps about missing this deer at pretty close range, 35 yards maybe. And about an hour later, here comes a spike. And she said, oh, it's just a spike. I'm not going to shoot him. I said, hey, you can shoot him if you want. I don't care. You never shot a deer with archery tackle.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to shoot it, you're not going to hurt anything. Well, he's kind of giving us a good shot, isn't he? And I said, again, if you want to shoot him, thump. She let the air out of this spike, so that she backed up from shooting a 2.5-year-old with a rifle, backed up and shot a 1.5-year-old buck with a crossbow, and I was tickled for her. After that, she didn't want to shoot another one. That's her prerogative. Now she only wants to shoot 4.5-year-old deer because she's kind of matured. She's only 22.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's going to mature at a different rate. My first deer ever was a button buck, and I was tickled to death with that deer.
Same.
Remember it like yesterday. So, everybody's going to mature at a different process. And as hard as it is now that you younger guys are finding neighbors that aren't cooperating, you think it's hard now, go back 25 or 30 years.
Right.
You're just trying to convince anybody that it's a legitimate way of managing deer. Whereas, as I pointed out, now we've got record buck harvest, record adult buck harvest, lowest percentage of year, places like Pennsylvania, you could even think about having a cooperative. That was unheard of 30 years ago. So despite where we are, we have to always reflect on how far we have come,
mm-hmm.
or we have educated hunters, young hunters. I find often that the young hunters understand deer management, the basics of balanced sex ratios, age structures, that sort of thing. They get it easier than the old timers many times. And that's why it doesn't surprise me that some of our young hunters are saying, no, I'm good.
Yeah.
And many of them are legitimately good. This is not, I'm doing it for dad, or I'm just, that's not what I want. And so, each their own. But I do have some concern, particularly if it's being forced by the parent,
mm-hmm.
that do this, because that's what I do after 30 years of hunting. I think that's a dangerous slope, and we ought to avoid it at all costs. And, hunters should have the opportunity to learn just like we did by punching some tags, shooting some deer.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you've only got a couple of those on a given property or management program, they're not going to cause your program, ultimate demise by taking a few 1.5 or 2.5-year-old bucks off most properties. So just kind of take that as part of the process.
Fortunately, I don't hear that a lot. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't know that I've ever heard a dad or an uncle say like, hey, my kid's only shooting.
Yeah, I don't know if it has to be said, though. I think in some cases,
or even implied.
It's just the implied or kind of the subliminal, even more so than that. Because, I mean,
have you seen that?
Well, I'm just thinking about some of the kids that I'm seeing just in social media. And there's kids shooting 180-inch deer at 9 years old right now. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but where do you go from there? I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Like, if I never shot a deer bigger than 160 again, I'd still hunt every year till the day I die.
Mm-hmm.
But like, as a young child, if you go out and you're in an area, you're in Iowa or you're in Kansas and you're shooting 180s and 200s, like, where do you go from there?
Yeah.
Like, what's the evolution?
It's like,
that happened.
These young TikTokers making $1 million as 12-year-olds. It's like, I think that the most unfortunate part of that is not the fact that it happened. Like, I'm happy for those people. That's awesome that you shot that 180-inch. Mm-hmm. It's awesome you made $1 million at that age. But what's unfortunate is that it would be. I know that I didn't at the age that you're seeing some of these kids. Yep. Like, I didn't understand, and I hadn't suffered the years of tags in my pocket to truly value when it did happen. And I think what came with that ultimately was, and I wasn't always this way, the understanding that, like, man, the size of the antlers and the score of the deer, it can only, there's a threshold. You can't continue to grow that. Like, we've talked about this a lot. And so we made a conscious decision at some point to say, yes, the size of the antlers are important, and it's something that we cherish. Like, excites us. We're hunting for that. But ultimately, I think it's the age and the history and the interactions that we have with specific, ideally mature animals that can continue to, it's constantly replenished.
And it's always new. It's fresh.
It's always new. It's always fun. It's always a new challenge. Mm-hmm. It may score more, it may score less. The age may vary slightly, but it's always a new challenge for us. And so that's what keeps us like,
Well, and I think and I'm not going to let you glaze over too much, but Brian, you're probably more in tune than Jared is with the sports side. But I look at it with the new like NIL and paying college athletes type of thing. You've got kids coming out of high school in their freshman year of college and getting sponsored for tens or hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, and they haven't played a snap or haven't played a tip-off in college sports yet. And it's like the reason that people used to work their tail off in college was the chance to be that very small, handful of people who made the elite level pro sports, and then you got paid. Now you've got these kids who, just based on having a great college or high school career and going to college, never even playing it down, and all of a sudden they're getting paid for it. It's like, what is the motivation for them to give everything they have in college to then go to the next level? Well, and they don't know how to handle it either. They're 17, 18 years old.
Here's my Brian, you'll find I don't know anything about sports. I don't watch them. But just like in hunting, it maybe also kind of a sensitive, topic here, but did you need a good dad or a good mentor, somebody to say, hey, listen, I'm not going to put you on that biggest buck I have on the property. Like, you got to earn it. That's sure. Grandpa's spot or whatever. There should be some introduced or forced hand holding of like understanding the process. In the same way, like those sports organizations or whoever that would be should say, listen, we're going to reward you the way, compensate you fairly, like for this or even generously, but we're also going to impose these restrictions or whatever to make sure that it's taken full advantage of or respected to the level that it needs to be.
Yeah.
Same. Sorry. Did I answer the question for everybody?
No. Well, I think it's just it's an interesting topic.
Is that right? Do you agree?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm concerned with having a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old in that are both getting into hunting. They've both shot 1.5-year-old 4 points. All right, that is the baseline. That is the buck that they've shot. And if they both want to shoot a 1.5-year-old 4-point next year or spike, like, great, do it. If they want to move up, even better. Like, my fear is that at some point, via school, because we're in a rural area, we've got a lot of kids in the schools that they hunt. And all of a sudden, Jimmy in homeroom class, says, well, my dad says you shouldn't even be shooting those deer until they're 5 years old.
Yeah.
Well, now it's the peer pressure aspect of it. And I mean, there's nothing worse on a kid than that. Sure. And it's going to happen.
My dad only shoots booners.
Yeah. And so like all of a sudden, you know, Carter starts to say, well, you know, a 3.5-year-old 8-point comes out and I'm like, man, kill this deer. And he's like, well, like, is it 5? And I'm going to look at him sideways like, what are you talking about?
Well, dude, and there's kids out there whose their grandfathers are wealthy, and they're taking them on high fence hunts, and these kids are killing 215-inch bucks. Oh, you know, the first day with a rifle at 100 yards. I've seen it happen. And then they go back to school and they're like, yeah, here's the one I shot. You know, and this kid that has 40 acres to hunt behind his parents' house is like, what?
Well, and not to fishtail this back to you, Brian, but I think a lot of people, and I will say myself, even being the small town Pennsylvania guy, like one of the first QDMA national conventions I went to was probably in 06, somewhere around there. And I start to meet a lot of the people who are involved in QDMA, and no offense, but they're a bunch of old white guys who had a lot of money and a lot of property, and they were from the South. And for me, being from small town Pennsylvania, I was like, man, like I get it why these guys are growing big bucks, but they're nothing like me. And I think that was call it the misconception maybe, or even the outside looking in view from a lot of people saying this is why QDMA won't work, is because all these people are just rich and have thousands of acres in the South and plantations, and you know, there's no way they can apply it to me who hunts grandma's 30 acres type of thing.
Yeah, and that was a huge challenge for the organization and the movement because, as I mentioned, it started in Texas, which is immediately considered different. Then it moved to the large plantation country of South Carolina, which, you know, clearly also had an advantage. The average property size is 5,000 to 10,000 acres. So that's very different than the norm for just about anywhere else in the country. And so it really took the Michigans and Pennsylvanias and Ohios and those areas that had smaller tracts of land and much higher hunter densities to start showing success there. And so it was really that was when it really, I would say the movement tipped over and became mainstream when we started, you know, hundreds, thousands of success stories on 80-acre tracts and 200-acre tracts and, you know, more normal everyday hunters, because the average hunter in America hunts on less than 200 acres. That's a fact. I mean, and even within the QDMA organization, many years I was there, you know, we surveyed our members, and our average member hunted on less than 400 acres. Despite what we think, you know, the data showed that our average member had slightly larger than average ground, but not that much. We looked at it. Yeah, there were some flyers in there that had 10,000, 20,000 acre places, but those were actually uncommon. Most everyday member of QDMA now, National Deer Association, at least unless the composition has changed, their membership is still pretty much at, you know, slightly above average, but not so far out of the range that it would be considered so different.
I still think the perception of the number of hunters to an amount of acreage in a way that you're still able to practice effective quality deer management or even have an enjoyable hunt seems to be way off, especially in terms of like what's promoted, maybe not necessarily what's happening. But I know like we've had experiencing with like leasing agencies, big ones, you know, that you know, a lot of people are getting leases through, and we've been on a lot of these properties that we've leased them ourselves. And we've gone out and said, you know, made our own assessment. We walk the property, you know, we you know, run trail camera surveys and stuff. And we say, man, you know, Jeremy, this is probably good for you and I to hunt. Like maybe you and I will hunt this, you know, a few times. Like we'll bring one of our dads out, and that's probably about all it can take. An example of that same property, let's say that's 300 acres, you know, like a 280 type deal, is getting promoted via these leasing agencies for 6 to 8.
6 to 8 guys. Yeah.
6 to 8 guys.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm looking at that like, how? Would you have one guy, you know, per ridge? Like, how does that work? There's not that many, for sure, not that many mature bucks here, you know, but barely enough deer. Like, how does that work in any type of a management setting? And maybe they're just not hunting 6 to 8
sure
at a time, but I think a lot of them are.
Well, I think what's also kind of been interesting, and you know, maybe even the last few years, and Brian, you brought it up about like a 40% success rate there on the buck harvest last year, is I've seen like a trend in people not wanting to kill does again, and not because not because of necessarily the old school mentality of like don't shoot the doe, as much as like they just don't want to kill does.
Yep.
They're like it's a pain, it's a nuisance.
You're
like,
right about the age demographic too. My uncle is a big one, dude. He's my uncle's 57.
Yeah,
and he is just really, he's like, and so one question I was going to ask you, Brian, once we get into it here, is like some of the myths I get about QDMA or misconceptions. I think doe harvest and those sex ratios is a big one, even for me. Mm-hmm. You know, there's been points in my life where I'm like, hey, I think this is right. You know, this 2 to 1 or 1 to 1, or we should shoot so many does. Mm-hmm. And then I've had to like, I don't know, question myself, or I was humbled at some point, or somebody proved me wrong, and I was like, I don't know. I don't know how many does you should shoot. I don't know what the ratio should be. I'm not sure how that's going to affect.
And it's a moving target. I mean, keep in mind, like, unless you're in a high fence, the ingress and egress that is constantly happening. You know, people ask that. I'm sure, Brian, you too. Like when I used to consult, you know, the first thing I would hear is like, well, how many does you want me to shoot this year? And it's like, you know, here's what it is now based on an August trail camera survey. Mm-hmm. But ask me again in December if I'm in the South, and it could be, you know, twice as much. Mm-hmm. Just because of the number of deer you're moving in based on your habitat and your food and stuff. So it's such a moving target. To Brian's point, even about the 1-year-olds, I've always told people, number one, normally when I recommended a doe harvest, it's a sticker shock, because they are like, whoa, like, what do you mean I need to shoot 50 doe on this 1,000 acres? It's like, you have way too many deer, like an astronomical amount. And you're affecting the resource, the space, you're affecting your bucks ultimately because of that.
And probably the most common argument you hear to that is, well, during the rut, I've got all the does, so the bucks are going to show up here.
That's it.
You know, and there's some validity to some of those comments. And so I'm like, I'm not Brian from QDMA. I don't know. I don't know. So, but we have him here. So,
well, I think one of the big trends we've seen, certainly, if you consider the QDM movement as kind of a pendulum that started, let's say, in the late 80s, early 90s, and it swung across and took over the country. And I would say it became, and it's not a proper word in Webster's dictionary, but ruleified, heavily ruled. You can't do this, you got to do this, you know. And I think the pendulum swung too far. Mm-hmm. People got tight about rules, buck age structure, button bucks, doe harvest. I mean, everything got too tight to where for many people it just wasn't fun anymore. Yeah. There was too much stress. And so I've been very pleased to see that pendulum start to swing back and hunters start to be much more relaxed and kind of settled into a longer term philosophy that has flexibility, that isn't rigid on we must kill every doe and 3 more. We sold that prescription in the late 80s and early 90s because it was right then, just as no doe harvest was right in the 70s. Mm-hmm. You know, we probably then oversold doe harvest, in all honesty, because, you know, I gave thousands of seminars that said shoot every doe you can plus 3 more. You know, that was my standing rule of thumb, because we just needed it at the time. Now we've got changing habitat and land use. We've got, you know, predator impacts on fawns for the first time at scale. And so we're seeing, you know, drastically reduced in some areas, drastically reduced fawn crops that used to average, you know, say a fawn recruited per adult doe. Now we're down in many areas half of that. You know, my fawn recruitment rate on my home farm has dropped in half in 10 years. We've measured this. We've got abundant predators. In our case, because we have such a robust deer herd, it isn't hurting us. It just cuts off the number of does we have to kill. So it's actually helped us a little bit. So we are seeing and this is tough as a blanket statement, but in some areas we are seeing a reduced need for doe harvest, not necessarily zero. And in some areas still very aggressive. So it's I would say it's less uniform in the prescription and much more site specific than it's ever been, based on an individual track, the goals, et cetera. You know, I would say that doe harvest is still a necessary part of the vast majority of deer programs in America. You know, when it comes to sex ratios of does to bucks and that sort of thing, obviously there's a lot of discussion and debate. And it comes down to really less about sex ratio and more about deer numbers that your property can sustain in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. If your property will hold 100 deer in a healthy state, you know, why have, you know, 70% of those as females? You know, why not increase the space and territories in which bucks can set up shop and use your property? So there's a you know, a total deer density issue that sex ratio is just one piece of. Is it necessary to be 1-to-1? No. Is 2-to-1 fine? In most cases, yes. Is 3 does per buck? To me, that's starting to get a little lopsided, frankly. So somewhere in that couple of does per, couple of adult does per adult buck is generally an acceptable range.
Mm-hmm.
Really depends on, again, if you have fewer does, there's fewer does producing fawns and fewer deer you must shoot every year. So if killing does is a pain in your backside, trim your doe population down and only, keep the number of deer on your property that you want to shoot mostly as bucks. So there's ways to get there from a lot of different angles.
Yeah. I suppose this question would be for both of you guys as biologists. Is there a way, without a dedicated trail camera survey, just because as accurate and as much as you'd like to do that, Jeremy, I've been friends for 10 years now, and we've been talking about doing a trail camera survey, an official one on my property. It's never happened. Mm-hmm. It takes time, and it's like,
yes,
like you said, it's somewhat not inconsistent, but
it's just a snapshot.
Inaccurate.
It's a snapshot in time.
Potentially inaccurate. So I guess my question is what would be, other than, the common sense ones, like a browse line, or complete abolishment of your food plots within the first couple of weeks of planting. How do you know? Can you look at a property or use some very basic trail camera information to say, we've got too many deer, we've got too many does, I'm going to shoot approximately my goal should be this. That anybody could take out and say, well, I've got this lease of 200 acres, hunt with 4 guys. And is there kind of a general rule of thumb that can be applied? Maybe it's by state basis, or I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of different types of data we can use to make assessments of deer health and deer density. Body weights and antler measurements, particularly in your young animals. Your young animals are your best reflections of your habitat quality at a given point in time. So we like to look at fawn body weights, year-and-a-half-old doe and buck body weights, antler development, that year-and-a-half-old buck age class, and where you've got some long-term information on a property. If you see those trending down, obviously that's a pretty big red flag that something you either don't have enough groceries or you've got too many deer or some combination thereof. We can look at lactation rates in does. We can look at habitat indices, what we call ice cream plants, the percent of those that are available or browsed to the nub in a given landscape. So there's a lot of information we can use other than trail camera data, but I would say that, and Jeremy can certainly attest to this, as is often said, wildlife management, or deer management in this case, is as much art as it is science.
Mm-hmm.
And I have worked with hundreds of landowners who don't run trail camera surveys. In fact, they didn't even have this as a technique for decades until recently, that were very astute, that really had a pulse on their deer herds. Hunter observation data, even analytically powerful. And I've watched many landowners manage very effectively without having a lot of hard data, science, if you will, just going by gut feel. And that'll scare my biologist friends to say that landowners can manage without science. But I have seen it. And I actually hunt with a gentleman that I would say is as astute as they get and have for 25 years. And I would say that he is in touch with our deer herd as much as any landowner that I've worked with. He's not a biologist. And we don't do trail camera surveys every year. We did do one this year, but generally they're 5-6 years apart, so long distance between them. Now we run trail cameras all the time.
Yep.
We go by observation and what we see and what our body weights tell us. And I would say that the only probably downside of that is typically a landowner who's managing that way will underestimate their deer density. Mm-hmm. Because if you go by what you see versus what you get on a trail camera, very different often, as we know.
It's tough. I mean, so Brian, I love that. I'm all about the gut feel, I would way rather just be like, well, seems like this, so let's do this. And that's worked out pretty well. But I've just been on my own property, I've just been kind of baffled as the years have gone on. And we've been in all of these stages of, taking QDM too serious to going back and forth on sex ratios to, you name it. We've been through those. And it just seems like over the years, we have just really struggled to have a thumb down on the herd, in the sense that 1 year, it may seem like, it's one thing. We're like, okay, it's pretty close. Seems like 1 to 2. We've got, 4 to 6 4-year-old or older bucks. And then the next year it'll be like we have 1 or 2 mature bucks, and there's like, all we're seeing is does. And then the next year it's like completely flopped. It's like, where's all the does at? It's like all I'm seeing is bucks. And so, and again, we're not running these trail camera surveys, or we're obviously not flying helicopters and doing counts and stuff, but it's like, it just seems very inconsistent without any major, habitat changes to kind of speak of. They've been relatively in line with each other.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and you're going to see much more variation with small properties, obviously, because in many cases,
this is a big one, Brian. It's a 1,000-acre property.
Okay. Well, that's a little unusual, but I would, obviously if you had data from surrounding properties, it would start to, as we say, normalize the data a little bit. You'd see a little less variation. The bigger the scale, the less variation you would expect. But we do see some pulses. We see mixing all cohorts occasionally, where all of a sudden, 1 year we're like, what happened to all our 2-year-olds? We just don't have any 2-year-olds this year. Only 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, but so we see these missing age groups that come through bad fawn crop years, just random variation. We see this year was the first year in a lot of years that we didn't have a good crop of older bucks on our property. And we have no reason for it, because, everything that we came out of last year's season should have had a really big crop of mature bucks, and we just didn't see them this year. And we have not just the 1,000 acres that I'm blessed to hunt, but we have about 4,000 acres in a co-op that we share data on. And we trail camera data across 4,000 acres. And it just seemed like it didn't happen this year. So you're going to have some of these random years that you just can't really put your finger on why. We didn't have any die off. We didn't have anything that we knew of. They didn't happen. So it's strange.
I think in my case, we've kind of like identified this as just we have conversations about it. It's like my property in particular there seems to be one of those ones that just isn't, it has happened, but isn't consistently a core area for like, this deer herd, like, especially during the rut, like, it just isn't one of those like solid blocks of timber with a, clear cut in the middle of it. It isn't that. It's kind of like a sparse, it's blockwoods here, blockwoods there type. And I think that plays a lot into like the inconsistency that we're seeing. And like you said, Brian, I have branched out and I've gotten permission on some surrounding farms, and we've made relationships with our neighbors, and it's given a lot of clarity to say, oh yeah, no, that buck got killed 3 miles away.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Stealth Cam.
Dude, where would we be without our cell cams?
I would definitely be divorced at this point.
Yeah, I hear that.
I mean, the fact is I spent more time checking cameras than I actually did hunting prior to cell cameras. Now, at least my wife can enjoy me being in the comfort of my own home, buried in my phone, checking those pictures.
Yeah, 100%. And dude, when it comes to trail cameras and definitely cell cameras, reliability is, I think, the number one thing that we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else. We've tried them all. There's other companies that make good cameras, but the fact is they all fail at some point. We have had such great success on a big variety. I mean, you and I ran over 30 cell cameras last year with Stealth Cam, and we hardly had any issues whatsoever. And the issues that we did have are probably self-inflicted. So in terms of reliability, there's not a better camera on the market than Stealth Cam, whether you're talking about... I think one of the interesting things, and I mean, I've done hundreds of trail camera surveys, since 2006, probably 2005. I don't do hardly any more, but one of the things that I started to run into, at first it was kind of, there's a science behind it. Here's the research, here's the science. You count your bucks, does, fawns, you identify unique bucks, use the algorithms. Here's your report. As I start getting into, call it more the practicum, I guess, Brian, of like actually into that, the fatal flaw typically was most of these surveys are done in August, September at the latest. If you're in the South, in the North, mostly August. If I'm trying to create a calculation, an amount of doe to shoot, which bucks to harvest, the true proper technique would be to conduct that probably in late October, early November, right? In the actual hunting season itself. Now, the problem is in most states I can't bait, right? So I can't have my baiting stations to do that stuff. And just because of the way that the technique was formed, there's not really an algorithm calculation for during the season, right? It's postseason or preseason. That's kind of how the survey's been laid out. And as I started to get into this more, the more clients are calling me and saying like, man, I know you said to take 10 does, but like I've got a field of 30 in front of me, right? And it's because it's 3 months later, and the herd has shifted, the habitat has changed, or hey, like I haven't seen any of these 5-year-olds that you've got in this buck album, but I've got all these other 5-year-olds that aren't even, we've never seen before. And so like, yes, it gives you a baseline and it's a great comparison from year to year, every other year, every 5 years. But if people are trying to use it, and this is the cool thing, I think, from a QDMA side that people glazed over, and we talked with Brian Burhans from Pennsylvania Game Commission a couple weeks ago, is the state is not going to manage on anything but a landscape level, right? And so in order to truly affect your local deer herd, right, you're going to have to manage on a level that is much smaller than what the state is managing at. And I think that QDMA was the first organization to bridge that gap between research and the general hunting public to provide that information. And I know, Brian, like with your Murphy's Law, even that you're doing with HuntStand now, has now provided landowners or cooperatives, you guys have the information. It exists out there. Get on the internet to manage at a local level beyond the regulations of what the state says. And for some reason, there's some people that I think do a great job at that. There's other ones who basically say, well, the state says I can shoot 5 does, so I'm going to shoot 5 does. That might not be appropriate for your property. You may only need to shoot 2. But you have to put in the extra effort because the state's never going to do it on your level. They're always going to be at a broader landscape level.
No doubt about it. In fact, I can relay a couple of stories from the early days of the QDMA movement where we were at a Southeast Deer Study Group meeting, as you referenced earlier, the large gathering of professionals, when the host agency's deer project leader told us that QDMA was not welcome there. And it wasn't but a handful of years later that they changed the rules of that body to give us the Career Achievement Award. So, we frightened a lot of agencies because we empowered individual hunters and landowners to make decisions. Mm-hmm. Spooked a lot of state agencies in the early days. And I remember an article published by, I'll just say, an upper Midwest deer biologist in Deer and Deer Hunting magazine early in this process, when it said the notion of a hunter as a manager should be discouraged. In other words, we don't want to empower the average hunter or landowner to make their own decision because they're too dumb to do it. Trust the biologists of our state. We're trained to do it. If you'll follow us, we'll lead you to Mecca. And they didn't want to empower hunters and landowners. And that was the whole QDMA movement, was empowering the individual hunter and landowner to make those decisions on their own ground. Because as you said, the state can't do it at anything other than a big scale, regional DMU unit or what have you, but certainly can't do it at 40, 80, 100 acre scales. And by empowering hunters and giving them the tools and the science behind everything from, deer nutrition to deer age structure, all these things that we now take for granted were all things we had to teach the everyday hunter 25 years ago and are still teaching today, but we empowered them. And that's what changed this whole thing. And that's what caused this upheaval in groundswell of interest in this movement, was all of a sudden hunters said, I can do this. I can learn this. I don't have to be a trained deer biologist to age deer on the hoof or to plant a food plot correctly and understand what soil pH is and what chemicals to put on my food plot to kill the weeds or the grasses or what have you. So all of a sudden this became everyday hunters' knowledge and playbook. Mm-hmm. That was powerful.
Well, and I think that, to the point of where we are today as a society, was the push, was the match to light the gasoline that kind of needed to happen, because we've asked the question several times. I think we asked it to Brian, maybe even Klaus, a couple people, and that, like, why do you think, like, if I look back 10, 15 years ago, like, how did we get to where we are today? We're more aware of mature deer. We're killing, in my opinion, bigger bucks than we've ever killed, probably because they're getting older. I don't think it was the TV shows, right? If anything, they discouraged, what was right and wrong to do. So, like, something happened, right, that has got us as a deer hunting community to evolve to the level of, where we are today, which is killing 40% success rate of bucks, and a large portion of those being 3.5 or older. And I have to think that maybe through the blood, sweat, and tears of it, a big proponent, and a big factor of that was QDMA.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, when the organization, the movement started, we were the kind of the sole game, if you will, in town when it comes to this kind of information for the everyday deer hunter. Today, that's not the case. Sure. Today, there are podcasts like yours, there are TV shows, there are other magazines, other experts out there. So there's just wealth of knowledge available. All a hunter today has to do is want to learn, because it's out there. And so, again, what's lifted this whole game is just an empowerment movement of knowledge. It's availability of reliable knowledge and a desire to want to consume and learn that. And luckily, there's a lot of folks out there that are diehard whitetail enthusiasts, not deer biologists, everyday hunters that say, I love learning about this stuff. I want to get engaged with habitat management. I want to learn about, TSI, timber stand improvement, or creating bedding areas, or food plots, or understanding how to age and score deer on the hoof. All this is out there. All somebody has to do is want it.
Yeah.
And that's a big game changer. And it's widely available in so many different sources now, whether it's podcasts, videos, print, social. I mean, all you got to do is open your brain and desire.
And what a crazy thing, man. I mean, to think about, again, those, 15, 20, 25 years ago to where things are today. And it's funny because, like, I remember clearly, I was probably either a sophomore or junior in high school, sitting in a gymnasium listening to Gary Alt tell 100 Pennsylvania deer hunters that the way that they did things is not going to be the way they do things moving forward. And even at that point, just because of how I grew up hunting, was kind of like, well, this doesn't seem right. Like, what do you mean we're not going to have a 3-day doe season? We're going to shoot does the entire gun season. Like, we're going to kill everything, and that was probably from my mentors, talking to me. And then I look at it now, and like, nobody back then would have ever said that Pennsylvania could produce 180, 190, 200-inch class whitetails consistently each year. And we are. So whether you're for antlers or not, I mean, nobody goes out in the field and says, I don't want to kill the biggest buck I see, right? Whether you say it out loud or you're just thinking it, you hope, you daydream sitting under a tree that, the biggest buck in the woods comes by you. Now, that may not be what you accomplish because you just want to punch a tag, but nobody isn't out there saying like, well, yeah, I don't want to kill a big buck. You do. I mean, that's the whole point. And so I think as you start to see these states come along, Michigan's another one where all of a sudden I'm seeing guys kill 170, 180, 190-inch deer out of these states. 25 years ago, people would have never said that, and at that point it wasn't even supported. To now, like, there's a large portion, I would say, of the hunters in these states who are excited about hunting in a state that traditionally didn't produce big deer. And so in a weird way, I don't know if that's made the state agency's job easier. I don't know if it's made it harder because of expectations now. But I think it's an interesting topic when you start to think now from a state level basis, what people can expect to see in their own state that traditionally growing up, was a pipe dream.
No doubt. In fact, looking back over that, I can really attribute three things that, in my opinion, have made the most change in this whole QDM philosophy and movement. The first was the introduction of food plots.
Huge.
People empowered, plant something, change the nutrition, increase viewing and harvest opportunities. So food plots obviously were the biggest rage of their time. They're still obviously important today, but I can remember when they were new. The second was the advent of the trail camera. And I was around when that first trail cameras came out, and people were like, wow, is that verified that many of these QDM programs were actually working? They were actually getting pictures of bucks. They weren't seeing as many. So many doubters saying this QDM stuff doesn't work. All of a sudden they put a trail camera out there and they go, crap, we've got, several 3 and 4 year old bucks out there. Then it became, how do we harvest these? Because the old ways of just walking through the woods aimlessly and shooting a deer didn't get it done on these 3 and 4 year olds.
Mm-hmm.
This next shift into strategy. And I would argue that technology like HuntStand, who I currently work for, is that next big piece, because it allows you to lay out that strategy. You can lay out the property with property boundaries, food plots. You can mark entry and exit routes to where you can get in and get out without bumping these older bucks. You can mark sign, you can measure food plots. You can look at your soil conditions. You can look at your hunt zone indicators, your wind, and your stand setups. You can look at habitat changes over time with different satellite layers. So now we have the ability with technology to efficiently lay out a hunting strategy that can allow you to harvest some of these older bucks that you're growing. And so I honestly think those three things have been the biggest three steps. I mean, obviously all surrounded by information and education and the availability of it, but I would argue that those three things have made the most fundamental changes in our hunting in the last 30 years.
I mean, dude, trail cameras especially, like to think back on, and trail cameras have been a big part of, my entire hunting career for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But I can remember, early on, what those early, Bushnell cameras, and I'm sure you guys can remember some even before that.
Oh yeah.
The original, my uncle talks about the trip cord, so you would just know at this time something tripped the cord and something, that was their trail cameras.
Yeah.
What a monumental shift in the way that we view, deer and wildlife. Just from at one point in time, it's like, hey, the most you're going to see of this thing is a real life sighting, or states like Pennsylvania, you can spotlight. Was pretty effective.
But still, observationally, it's rare.
To almost overnight or within the course of a year or two, here's pictures of all these animals you've never seen before that live out there. And now you have all this new information about how to manage them, how to hunt them, what dynamic that creates with your neighbors and everybody else on social media.
Well, and just think about it even now. Like,
it's
think about
different.
The number of individual buck pictures you get on a particular property. And then think about this past season, how many of those bucks did you actually see? I mean, it's a minute fraction.
Yeah.
The fact is they're there, you're getting them on camera.
Crazy.
But think of like how much time observationally in the stand, and then you look and you're like, maybe out of 12 or 13 unique bucks, you've seen 4 on the hoof.
Maybe.
It's a mind blowing. I think what was you bring up the technology, it's a cool thing. So like my dad and I just bought this new farm in Southeast Ohio, right? And so my dad and I are sitting in this future food plot, right? And like in my head, I brought some foraged beans down and some corn down that I'm gonna plant. And I'm like, man, I'm trying to plan it out. And literally all I do is like pull out my phone on HuntStand and like measure the food plot. I'm like, okay, this is 2 acres. And so, before, because I'm not a farmer, I'm eyeballing this. I would have said, I don't know, maybe it's 3 acres, and I would have overseeded, by an acre. And I just literally pull it out and trace it. And I'm like, okay, this is acre. Hey, this one's a half acre. We're going to do brassicas up here. We're going to do brassicas in this quarter. And we're going to do beans back here with corn through it. And it's like, I'm just like, everything is right there at my fingertips. And people will say, we talked about it with cell cameras, that the advent of this technology has taken away from it. And I think that you can absolutely abuse it. There's no doubt in my mind that you can abuse it. But what it has given is the ability to be more involved 365 days a year than you ever could have before. Like I think about the trail camera stuff of like how many trail cameras I have out. There's no way I could check all of those trail cameras. It'd be impossible, and then the time away from family or work or whatever to try to do it, not even hunting, just checking trail cameras, to now where it's like, I have all of this stuff coming back to a single hub and I don't have to be there.
I think the potential negative, like, and I'm with you. Like, I also would advocate for those things. I certainly enjoy them. But I hear the argument from, my uncle being a big one or guys in his age class that would say, man, that's great, but there's just nothing like going into a property, reading a sign, and seeing a big buck for the first time, and killing them, doing the thing. And I respect that opinion a lot, and in fairness, we're all hunting for the same, as we've said many times, limited resource. And all of those technologies give us, to a guy who elects not to use them,
an advantage.
Somewhat an unfair advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like I see that as well, and I want the sport to progress, and I want technology to be involved, obviously not neglected, but I also have like some sense of, regret, remorse. Like, well, I understand where they're coming from. I don't want that to get lost.
The only downfall I see, and it's purely just from an emotional standpoint, is the element of surprise, right? Like with cell cameras, especially, but trail cameras in general, like, but prior to that, you saw a big buck rub or fresh scrape, and you're again, it's that daydreaming of that giant buck coming through the woods. You just don't know what it is, and even like this deer, I was in the stand checking a trail camera card because it was before cell cameras, checking a trail camera card, and saw that deer for the first time the same night I killed him.
Yep.
And so there was still that element of like, oh my God,
No
that's
doubt.
a giant.
It's
And
just different.
Yeah. And so to now where it's not, I wouldn't say 100%, but I mean, in most of the properties I hunt, I probably know 90+% of the deer, especially bucks that are on that property. So very rarely do I get a surprise. I
mean,
guess.
dude, that right there has to be, in my opinion, like the biggest shift in deer hunting. Like trail cameras are the key that makes QDM possible.
Yeah.
Because without information on your deer herd, it can't be
100%.
practiced. I just don't think that the general public, even myself, I make lots of mistakes. To be able to age a deer on the hoof for the first, the biggest difference is like before trail cameras and QDM, you're seeing a deer for the first time. You've seen a sign in the area. You say, I think it's this. You're making a call. It's literally the opposite now, where you know almost 80% of the time exactly who it is, and you just have to identify it. And so the pro is you've become a very capable herd manager. I recognize the deer. I have information. I'm gonna target him with precision and and accuracy. I'm gonna take him out. Versus, but what you lose there, I think, is like what we said. That old school element of first time in, reliance on reading the sign. It's kind of it's a give and take in that regard.
It's the difference between the hunting experience and then trying to be a manager,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I can't go out there in Pennsylvania, especially, and confidently pass, a 4.5-year-old 8-point unless I know that there's a 5.5-year-old around.
Sure.
Like, why would I let him by when there may not be a bigger buck? That might be the biggest, baddest buck in the area. Well, why would I pass him?
Mm-hmm.
Unless I'm planning on going to other areas with that same tag. But if I'm not, I mean, your goal should be to go out and kill the oldest, baddest buck in that area, right? That should be the goal. But if you don't know who that is, how can you be effective at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes down to each individual person and their own, what their tolerance for technology or advantage. And, even using the greatest technologies that we have today, which are incredible, whitetail's still a whitetail. They're still the hardest animal to consistently hunt. And, no doubt about that. It still has an element of magic and mystery, even with all of the technology that we can bring to it. Seeing that deer for the first time that you've only seen in trail camera photos,
No doubt.
is still, gets that heart racing. A hunter has the ability, if that's too much technology, to use less of it, to shift from a rifle to a crossbow, or a crossbow to a vertical bow, or a traditional bow. We can find ways to limit ourselves, and that's the personal decision we have as hunters.
Yeah.
We don't have to all buy into, everything technology to our advantage and long range shoot them at 1,000 yards with precision rifles. We can make our own decisions of what experience we want.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's what I do personally. I personally target individual bucks based on age, not on antler. I want to shoot the oldest deer that I can. That's my personal objective. I'm quite happy passing younger bucks. I've shot plenties, but I'm at a different stage in my career than many hunters. Other hunters may be somewhere different on that scale and want all the advantage they can. So again, it comes down to personal choice, and thankfully we have the flexibility to do that in this country, to limit ourselves to the extent we want.
Isn't that cool that we have that flexibility? I mean,
Absolutely.
and I think to the neighbor aspect, because I hear it, like, and we get beat up for it too. Like, if I say, hey, I don't want that guy to be a crossbow hunter, like, the cool thing is I can do, whatever is legal on my property or whatever is legal on public land, and you can do the same. And it's whatever you choose to do. If I choose to hunt with a compound bow and you choose to sit on a field and shoot 1,000 yards with a high-powered rifle, like, great. Like, my choice was to go that route, and your choice was to go that route, and so be it. It's legal.
And I would say too, like, on private land, I think what Brian is saying is absolutely true. I think, like, you've got more of an ability to, like, make decisions, when you're not competing against people on your own land. Like, you're still going to have neighbors and stuff having an impact on the herd, but I think it's tougher to try to apply that statement to public land, because if I want to waltz in there with a traditional bow with no trail camera or any technology, no HuntStand, I'm at a pretty serious disadvantage to somebody that has been studying it for weeks, has cell camera information, and goes right in with a crossbow. And I mean, like, that's two very different things. It's like trying to enter a professional bodybuilding competition without taking any steroids. Like, good luck.
Yeah.
Might.
There are two things that as we move forward as a society, I don't worry. I mean, people bring up the division aspect. It exists. It's always going to exist. It's just human nature, right? Competition.
I think it should be embraced. The differences between hunters, I think we really enjoy that. I mean, I really get a kick out of hearing, why crossbow hunters approach things the way that they do, and in the same way, traditional bow, and we're kind of like in the middle in this compound group, and
neither of us are trying to put the other one out of hunting. No. It's just understanding why you do this and why I do that, and why I don't like 100%. This or why you don't like that. But the two things that really worry me are what we talked about. One, which is the kid thing. Like, I worry that at some point my kids are going to say, well, I don't. Jimmy says that we shouldn't shoot bucks that are younger than 4, and I'm gonna say, well, Jimmy's an idiot, and then shoot that deer, but that's a natural reality, and everything that comes with today's society and social media is pushing children that way. They, at some point, whether it's somebody at school or they feel that they're lesser of a hunter because they're watching all these 8 and 9 and 12-year-old kids shooting 180-inch bucks in Iowa or whatever, they're going to feel lesser. And that's going to be an issue. The second one is the amount of people in a public land area that could affect the quality of the hunt. That doesn't necessarily mean as much as being successful, as much as it is if I go in and I'm a hardcore public land
successful
hunter.
In terms of harvest.
Right.
If your goal is to not see people, your success is waned.
Yeah, it's happening more and more and more, which is around the number of hunters, but it's also around access, right? I mean, it's always been an issue. And so that worries me for the future, especially as we have hunters who, if you're hunting public land, you're already a leg down, meaning you don't have access to an unpressured property that you can go at any time you want, right? You're in the position that you have to hunt public land because you don't have access to something else. You don't control that public land, which means other people can be on it. And I think that my fear is at some point people start to say, and it'll ebb and flow, right? Because when you drop off hunters there, and you will, because the experience will be shit, you'll then increase the quality of public land because there'll be less people. A bunch of people drop off the board and it'll get better, and then you'll see it ebb back up and you'll have more people come back in. So it's an ebb and flow. Right now, we're at the top. Public land is full. It's bursting at the seams.
Yeah.
We're about to drop. People are just going to say, forget it. It's not worth me going out. But that's going to affect our hunter numbers overall too, which affects the economy, which affects everything that we do in conservation. So there's a give and take there that worries me, and I don't know what the solution is there.
Yeah. So, I'll say this, kind of a big picture statement here, and I've had the good fortune of living and working around the world on deer issues. There is no place better than the United States of America to hunt and fish and enjoy the outdoors. There is no place on the planet that has the opportunities we do, to have the resources we have. So hunters should never lose sight of the fact of how dang lucky we are to live in these United States, where we have state fish and wildlife agencies working on our behalf. They're not the enemy. I know in many states, hunters consider their state agency the enemy. These are folks with good intentions trying to do right. We have hunters paying Pittman Robertson taxes and such to fund these agencies. We have literally considered the gold model of the entire world when it comes to this. So let's never forget how lucky we are, and how important this is to so many of us. So we're a blessed nation. We should never overlook that.
No doubt.
Yep, for sure, man. Well, listen, Brian, we took a bunch of your time this morning, man. We appreciate you coming on the HUNTR Podcast. And I guess a couple things before we go. Obviously, anybody listening to this, make sure you check out HuntStand if you haven't downloaded already. Free to download in the app. I'm
gonna give a quick shameless plug here too on HuntStand. Dude, when we were hunting, we hunted Shawnee National Forest this year. Colton and I were running and gunning on all over the place.
Yep.
And per our discussion today, running into people everywhere. I mean, it was tough. I don't think we saw a deer over 2.5-year-old. But I will say we dove into one spot, and I've got several mapping softwares. I've used everything from Google Maps to Onyx to to HuntStand and beyond. And, we find that each kind of offers its own unique advantage. And so, we balance the field there. And so I think I used onX to identify like where this one block of public land was. And I was like, for the life of me, I could not figure out how to access this piece that we wanted to get into. And so I jumped over to HuntStand knowing that the actual mapping
quality,
the quality is definitely better. There's no doubt about it. And it actually revealed that through the center of this giant thicket, it was probably like a 30 or 40 acre, it was a planting. It was like some kind of government planting. It was like 7-8 foot tall, just gnarly. Like there's no walking through it. This HuntStand imagery revealed that there was actually a man-made cut trail right down through the middle of it. I mean, it was like a machete trail. Like literally somebody went in there with a weed whacker or something, and I was able to see that, and I was like, how bizarre. I just said I bounced back to both Google Maps and to onX. Wasn't there. And so I felt like we had a real advantage. I was like, man, everybody that's using onX or Google Maps or whatever is missing this spot. There's no doubt. It's just the guy that made it, maybe some of the locals and people using HuntStand. And so like I was...
Yeah, because it wasn't visible from the road. You had to go into this section just a handful of feet, and then it was like, oh, there's
and
the
when
trail.
I realized that, I had to go back to all my spots that I've have onX pins from in the back. And don't get me wrong, we still use onX. It's a good tool, as is Google Maps. But dude, I have uncovered some things with HuntStand, and it's been super helpful.
Yep.
Well, I can tell you that we just finished what we do is regular updates of all the property information in North America. And to give you some scale of how much data that is to crunch, it took basically the equivalent of 6 rooms of computers, 8 days. We had to pay for this third-party server to, update that much data for North America. That shows you the data that we collect and update on a regular basis. It took, basically a room of computers, as big as computers. They don't have to be that big today, but these are giant mainframes. 8 days nonstop just to update our property information, which is now date today. So it's something we take very seriously. We also have a monthly satellite update that no one else offers. So if you want to see what
I've seen that.
It looks like now, because a lot of hunters don't realize this, that most of the Google images you see are months to years old.
Yeah.
Updated in rural America very often because, there's not a lot of interest. They update the city maps all the time.
Yep.
When it comes to, rural America where we hunt, most of the apps out there have old imagery. Certainly it's not even seasonally appropriate in most areas, let alone recent.
Yep.
So we offer monthly satellite updates so you can actually see that clear cut or where that flood impacted the property or a burn or what have you, or crops in the field, things that may matter to you. So a lot of cool features. I definitely encourage hunters to check it out.
I think the crops feature has been a big one for me. Like you can clearly tell what's planted in areas, and so even like places I'm looking at now, I'm going back to last summer and be like, oh, for sure was corn in this field. It'll likely be beans this year. Yeah. And that's invaluable information, especially when you're going to an area that you've never been in.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, it's to your point earlier, Brian, like the fact that you can sit in your home states away and literally nail down a place and be like, pretty damn sure this is going to be the spot. And it's because you've done all of this fact collecting prior to even stepping foot in the property.
Well, and dude, it's one thing for, if you're within an hour, 2 hours of this place that you hunt, like more than not, you're going to have an opportunity to run out and get boots on the ground and see what's happening there. But, if you hunt out of state, especially like, we try to draw in Kansas as often as we can. And it's like, man, that time is so critical. Like after we've driven 16, 17 hours to get there, we've got, 5 days to hunt essentially, or however long we're able to give ourselves. It's crucial. Think about 5 days to kill a mature buck.
Yep.
Not easy. And so, to use technology like HuntStand to be able to identify, down to the tree, like the imagery is so crisp. Like I'm not just saying that, like you can literally see everything that's there. And obviously
as a bow hunter, that's what I want. I want to know the tree I'm going to, not the area, and then be like in the dark trying to find the tree.
Dude, I have gotten down to the point of like, I'm going to take that cow trail all the way and I'm going to hop this gate that I can see right there. It's like,
yeah,
it's awesome. It's invaluable for the non-resident hunter for sure.
Well, and I shared before the podcast we chatted, and I shared that I just got back from a predator hunt in South Texas, and it was a ranch side, never hunted, 5,000 acres. We get there, literally we had a 1 hour quick drive through the property with the landowner. That was our entire knowledge of the property. And he shared a few spots that he'd seen the odd bobcat or coyote. We dropped pins as we drove of where he had seen them. We get back to the ranch house in minutes. We're able to download the map, look at all those markers, figure out that all those markers that where he had seen coyotes or bobcats occasionally were on either side of a big central drainage in the property. We immediately looked at all those marks and said, all right, here's our first 6 stands that we're going to hunt, calling stands, places to call from. We set up a plan of attack where we knew exactly where to park. We knew where the wind was blowing through HuntStand. So we literally had a 6 stand in a row sequence on the first afternoon, first day, 90 degrees, wind blowing 35 miles an hour. We killed 2 coyotes in those first 6 sits. Strategically, efficiently, didn't lose any time hopscotching because we had HuntStand. We could not have done it. This ranch was a maze of gas and oil and wind turbine roads. You'd have never found your way around, never, systematically hunted that without lots of time on the ground. We did it in minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I credit that to HuntStand technology, allowing us to hunt efficiently and effectively and not waste time. Time's valuable. We had 2 days.
Yeah.
So, and it counts. You don't have time to sit there and power scout on the ground. You got to just roll.
Then you got to roll. No, I love that, man. Well, awesome, Brian. Well, listen, man, we appreciate you coming on this morning. Like I said, I mean, what you guys have at HuntStand is awesome. It's such an invaluable tool. Even if you're in an area that you're familiar with, always get a new look on that section and that property to see what's around you or what's on neighboring farms. I mean, any critical information you can collect here, leading up to the season is huge. And dude, we'll have to get you on here right before the season starts and kind of pick your brain on what's going on here up in the upcoming fall and just talk strategy from there.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
All right,
you, Brian.
We'll talk, man.
Thank you, guys.
Cool. It's always awesome having Brian on there. I mean, what a wealth. Guy's been a biologist for 35 years, and think of starting in Texas and then going to Georgia and then Australia and then back to QDMA and now at HuntStand. I mean,
dude, the QDMA is like not a small movement, and it sounds like he was a major part of that. Like he's a trusted and respected resource.
Huge, to me, that group was the foundation that then propelled outside people from there that then created the society of deer managers we see now. Mm-hmm. They themselves were never, I think, over 65 or 70,000 members, which always blew my mind because you think there's 10 million whitetail hunters in the country. And I think it proved that, Brian mentioned several times the scars that he bears is that like it was not an easy thing. They didn't go out there and say, we want every deer hunter in the United States to love us, right? They said, this is the right thing for deer moving forward and for deer hunting moving forward, and we're going to do it. And because of that, they didn't grow into a million plus, government organization or not nonprofit organization like a DU or an NWTF. Like think about the number of duck hunters and turkey hunters in the country, way less than whitetail hunters. Yet those guys average about 1 million members a year, and QDMA was sitting at 65 to 70,000. It was because they took the road that was going to be a lot, tougher and unaccepted because it was the right thing to do. Here we are 30 years later, and I would say that we probably have one of the best deer herds that we've ever had, depending on which end of the scale you look at. If you're thinking quality bucks, quality deer, better deer, I think we are. If you're thinking just pure numbers and opportunistic for harvest, then no, because you would have rather been back living where you saw 30 does and a spike in a herd. But that wasn't necessarily what was best for the habitat, and it surely wasn't best for the deer herd. Mm-hmm. Now we're back to where we're balancing quality deer herds with the quality habitat, and,
yeah,
people can argue against it, but that's where we're at.
I think it's just any organization, like varying based on like what its members are entailed to or how it's set up, but like it's only ever going to show like a fraction or a percentage of the people that are actually like tuning in or learning from it. So like I think the QDMA in particular, why I said it only has like 60 or 70,000 members. was probably affecting the way that like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hunters
Absolutely.
were applying information to their land or the places that they hunt. Me being one of them. Like I think I was a member of the QDMA for a few years, and then I was like,
and I don't know how many people are listening to this now, but being that they probably shut the podcast off, but if you're wondering where did QDMA go, it's now the National Deer Association, NDA, right? It was QDMA and the National Deer Alliance. Now they've kind of come together and formed the National Deer Association, NDA, and that's what's moving forward. I believe still more of an organization, but also more of a, call it a lobbyist group to go to these different agencies and try to get certain things pushed forward, which for the betterment of deer management and deer hunting. A lot of that in today's society is behind CWD and disease management and stuff like that.
I mean, I could be wrong about this. I think I was kind of young as it was happening, but like it seemed like there was like controversy or some like disagreement or politics that got introduced to like whenever that transition was happening. And like I remember at the time thinking like, I don't really want any part of that. And I think there was probably a lot of people in that same boat. And so in terms of like memberships or subscription to QDMA or NDA or, whatever the name of the organization is that's actually representing it, while the ideas of the QDMA, I think, it instilled in people, like still exist, and it's obviously yielding some awesome hunting opportunities across the country. I think that participation or maybe even opinion of those has kind of dropped off.
And I know the National Deer Association still does a lot of stuff. In fact, they just did a big stored course at Whitetail Properties headquarters.
Who would be, that's right. Who would be, just like off the top of your head, some people that are involved with NDA?
Kip Adams is still one of the main guys, and Kip was part for a long time. Matt Ross, who was been with those guys for a long time. Nick, I'm going to butcher his name, Pinziato, is the new CEO of NDA. So, he's a Pittsburgh guy.
Kip is the one I'm, obviously most familiar
and I
with.
mean, most people know of Kip from all of the stuff he's done through QDMA and Whitetail Properties and things like that. And so Kip is still, Chief Conservation Officer, or basically the head of education for National Deer Association. And he's still, I mean, if you go to Kip's pages and stuff, I mean, he's still putting out content like all the time.
Yeah.
But those are your main guys, anymore. And it always was like a tighter circle. You had, regional memberships. What they don't do anymore is they don't do like the fundraising campaigns and the regional banquets and things like that anymore. It's more of a donation and funding based type of organization at this point. So, and I'm sure we'll get Kip and those guys on at some point.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to say about the QDMA and just the QDM movement in general is like, I think that, and this isn't their fault necessarily, but I think like one of the areas that it kind of went south or people have a negative connotation of those organizations is that, like, we had a conversation a bit ago there about like the antler size and, taking it too far to like an extreme, to where you're prioritizing your deer management over, relationships with people or your neighbors and stuff. I think that definitely happened. A lot of us have probably been on the verge, even of myself personally, of saying, "Hey, like do not shoot these 3-year-olds. Like this is the most," and and you put stress on relationships and stuff that way, and like
it was more of that division and tension we talked about that came up.
So I get it. I get why people would be like, "Oh, QDMA ruined hunting," because some people. You can take it too far. Like it's valuable information and it is best practices for wildlife management, but you can take that too far, and it can take away from the overall experience.
I think one of the hardest things was the principles of what QDMA stood for and did from an education, information, working with agency standpoint was all right. Where the association fell short and why I feel like it doesn't exist anymore is because most of the members of the association did not mirror the average whitetail hunter or even the average deer manager who's a whitetail hunter. I know Brian went in and talked about the land breakdown, but from a business professional standpoint, most of those guys were white collar type workers. They weren't blue collar, work really hard, go out and hunt on the weekends on grandma's 30 acres. They were guys who had really high-end professional jobs, household income was high. And so it was tough to relate to, I think, for so many people that loved whitetail deer hunting. In fact, so many people who probably were out there planting food plots and doing TSI. Guys like Jeff Sturgis will tell you that QDMA is the reason that deer hunting is like it is in the country and is as good as it is in the country.
Yeah.
But the association itself and being a member of that association, even to somebody like me, felt like not a match.
No doubt. Well, somebody like Jeff is a perfect example of like someone who's bridged the gap between QDM principles and
practical use.
Small landowners.
Yep, practical use.
Or permission, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I see it. You see these people pulling to these directions. Whereas a group like Ducks Unlimited or National Wild Turkey Federation is about hunting and managing and preserving and growing wild turkeys and waterfowl and stuff. There is no political divide there, right? It is just people enjoying those sports, but it's also because we said it a couple weeks ago, who passes up 2-year-old gobblers or who doesn't shoot the 2-year-old, Drake Mallard. Like, no, you drop them, you shoot both of them. Whereas now this organization is saying, don't shoot the 2-year-old buck. Mm-hmm. It's a whole different pathway when you get into that segment of selection. And I think that's why, the demise of QDMA happened as an association, because it was against the grain of what people want, which is don't tell me what I need to do type of thing.
Well, it almost got taken over, I guess, by celebrities, TV shows, people that, so like while the QDMA, it seems like their intention initially was improve the deer herd,
and they did on a state level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of these guys that promoted QDMA were like, grow giant bucks.
Mm-hmm.
That was the thing. And so that's what the idea that kind of like got relayed to the general public. And so they're like, well, like shooting big bucks is cool, but like, dude, these guys are setting a standard that's unrealistic. Therefore, QDMA is like tarnishing our hunting experience.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
And that's, most of your Pennsylvania guys, especially your old timers, would say that QDMA killed deer camps.
Yeah.
I bet Wisconsin and Michigan would say the same thing, is that, we went to deer camp, we could tag any buck that we want, we could see 100 does in a day. It was fun. It was exciting. And QDMA killed that because instead of that, we may kill way bigger bucks, but we're going to put one, if any, deer on that buck pool now. We're not going to see hardly any deer. Whereas before it was like, I saw 100 does, just no bucks today. And it's in a complete 180 of lifestyle change. Now, from a fundamental environmental standpoint and the habitat, it's the right way to go. But when people live that lifestyle for a good 20 years at least, to change them and tell them no is tough. Now, when that generation fades, right, and passes on, the new generation that's coming up, most of the people like us, we grew up with QDMA in place.
Yeah.
So it's the norm, right? And that's why I do think you'll see a resurgence of deer camps, because we're going to look for that camaraderie within the bounds of what we expect from QDMA or QDM, right? Quality Deer Management. Whereas that older class that's still around went through 20 years of what they thought deer camp was. QDM killed deer camp for 20 years, and now they're just bitter about it.
Yeah. I think there's been a retention of the principles of QDM that's been very positive.
100%.
We're seeing a lot of the outcomes of that, like in states like Pennsylvania, where we're killing a lot of big bucks.
And it's not because necessarily of the state level, it's because landowners on a micro level are accepting those principles and applying them.
Yeah. And that started with QDMA. I mean, I give them a lot of credit for that.
100%.
And at the same time, dude, you're seeing like a die-off or kind of like a fading of like these big TV show personalities that people associated with like the negative aspects of QDMA. And so what you have like left at the end of the day is people who care about quality deer management or access to public lands. Like, we've got this new group of hunters with a a fading or removal of like those negative connotations attached with them. And so like I think I'm pretty optimistic about the ideas on that moving forward.
And before anyone jumps on the bandwagon of like, well, I only hunt public and there's no QDM on public. One of the best examples I saw of QDM was when I lived in Mississippi. There was a property called Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge, huge national wildlife refuge right outside of Mississippi State University. And around that were surrounding landowners. And so the National Wildlife Refuge plus the surrounding landowners formed this cooperative, QDM cooperative. And so we had antler restrictions and things and check stations where we were aging and weighing every deer that was harvested on that National Wildlife Refuge, plus the data from the surrounding landowners. And I mean, I watched in the pine forests of Mississippi, I watched multiple 160 8-year-old bucks come off of that thing. I'm just talking gnarly mass giants. And it's because they had effectively 50,000 acres in a cooperative between the National Wildlife Refuge and the surrounding private landowners. Yeah. And so it was like anybody that hunted that was benefiting from the QDM cooperative.
Yeah.
And the habitat work that came with it. That's the other thing. People think about antler restrictions and doe harvest and stuff. QDM was also, that's where Craig Harper and Bronson Strickland, that's where these guys were the first to come out and say, this is how you make deer habitat. Yeah. That was through QDMA.
Yeah.
So those things all together formed to what we have today on a micro level. If you're out there planting food plots, you're a QDM supporter. Mm-hmm. That's who started that stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's those kind of things that maybe you don't agree with all the principles, but it got us to where we're at now. And, look what you're producing. Look what you're doing on a yearly basis on your property. You're not just walking out there and shooting the first deer you see.
I mean, it seems like growing big bucks, if that's the goal, it shouldn't be the primary goal, but if it's a goal, because of QDMA is not complicated.
No.
That said, it's also not easy because there's a lot of variables that can have an impact on that. But they just need age, man. If you're in an area with decent habitat and good food, and they can get to an age to show of maturity, you're going to grow big bucks. It's not complicated, but it is hard to get them to that age.
It's the reason that I will never go against cameras, in that the fact of you can't confidently pass up a deer unless you know that there's a deer that meets your criteria out there beyond that.
Can't pass a deer.
You can't. If you pass a 3-year-old because you're like, I want to kill a 4-year-old. We had this talk, I think, with Eberhard.
Yeah, I'm with you.
What if there is no 4-year-old?
Yeah.
Should you keep hunting?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
What's the point?
Sure. Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, that's the conversation we were having there, is that trail cameras enable us to practice QDM.
Yeah, and the guys who are saying, well, it takes the fun out of it and the surprise out of it, were shooting the first 2-year-old they saw. Mm-hmm. They weren't worried about passing them to 3 or 4.
Generally speaking. I mean, these are general statements. There are definitely guys that don't have to use trail cameras that can go into a place where they know big deer are, and they can pass 2- and 3-year-old bucks.
Yeah, guys like Barry and Gene Wenzel are 100%. Using trail cameras. And those guys were killing 180-inch deer in Iowa with recurves long before trail cameras even existed.
Yeah.
But they also know, should I kill this 180 or is there a 200?
Well, and what it comes down to is, like, if you... Like, I don't know, other than, if you remove trail cameras just from like any kind of scenario, what are you left with to determine what's possible? Is it just like what you see driving across?
Purely observational, sign-based,
historical data, just what's been harvested, and that's probably gets you 70% of the way there. Of like,
I bet if you remove trail cameras within the next 7 to 8 years, you would see a dramatic decline in the quality of bucks in the country, because people couldn't pass a 3-year-old not knowing there's a 4-year-old on that property.
Well, and not only that, I think they don't have time to study these animals. Yeah, so I'd agree.
Yeah, probably. I mean, aging a deer on the hoof is one of the hardest things to do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's hard.
Especially in the moment. So if you're sitting there and in your mind you want to kill only 4-year-olds, and here comes a nice 130-inch buck blowing through, odds are he's a 3-year-old and you just killed him.
Yeah, 3 to 4 is the hardest one.
And that's not a bad...
1-year-old's pretty easy to tell. 2-year-old's pretty easy to tell. between 3 and 4 is tough. It is tough. But then, once they're 4+, that becomes pretty obvious, usually 5+ especially.
But I mean, those are the things that you would see a dramatic decline. The one thing we didn't get into, Brian, with, and this is, I'm for them, but I'm against them because I know long-term the trend that happens is antler point restrictions. And we'll have to bring that up with him in another topic, but I'm for antler restrictions from a landscape level because it gets deer from age class 1 to age class 2. I'm against deer antler restriction points because ultimately you're high grading the better quality deer at a vulnerable level at 1 year old usually out of the population. And at some point,
would you advocate for a different metric? Ultimately, age is what you should be striving for.
Well, I know that Mississippi's gone to inside spread and main beam, and it's extremely difficult, but it's also way more effective.
Is it?
So that way I can kill the giant 4-point who's a 4-year-old who would never meet antler criteria here in the state of Pennsylvania.
Interesting.
Because he needs to be out of the population.
Yeah. Because, I mean, in a perfect world, you say, okay, 3-year-olds are older, 4-year-olds are older, whatever it is, and every hunter would say, okay, great. That's, I can identify
the acceptance level. Right now, the acceptance is I don't have to shoot a 1-year-old, but I'm surely not passing a 2-year-old. That's a broad statement, but that is the deer hunter voice right now. The majority of deer hunters would say, yeah, I'm okay if I don't shoot a 1-year-old, but I'm sure not passing that basket rack 2-year-old. We're not at the level to say 3+. But according to Brian's
or
data,
whatever it is,
we're getting there.
All we're talking about there is recognizable features that are an indicator of age. I think ultimately age structure is what.
And the only way you're going to do that to have it objectively, not subjectively, is antler criteria, because it has to be measurable, countable, something. If it's body features,
it is.
It's subjective.
Sure. It's harder.
Yeah. And even still, once I kill that deer, you may think it's 3. Teeth may say it's 4. Semena Manuali might say it's 5. Who's right? None of us.
I'm trying to think of a comparison. It's just like looking at people, and it's like I can take my best guess and say, I think you're in your 30s. Like I'll say mid 30s. And that's
Thank you.
Yeah. That's you're welcome. That's subjective, versus something that's like, you handing me a card or like you having holding up
my birth date on my arm,
a mark that says, hey, this is,
Yeah.
And so antler restrictions are like an attempt at that, it's to say, hey, antlers are like the best indicator of age. And maybe that's true. Maybe it can be refined.
It is to a point. It's the least subjective measurement of age.
Yeah,
that's why.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, people right now will say, well, how would I ever tell a main beam or spread when that deer's running through the woods? And the answer is you don't shoot them. If you're not sure, you don't shoot them. And their answer will be, well, then I missed my opportunity. So be it.
Yeah. Well, and dude, we should consider ourselves lucky to have such an easy point restriction guide to follow. Dude, I don't know if you're aware of any of the RAM restrictions and stuff in terms of full curl and
stuff.
It's either, full curl past the nose or they have to be 8+ and have to age the animal.
Not that you care too much, and I think it still is in Mississippi. You can only shoot a gobbler if it's full fan or a 6-inch beard.
Yeah.
It has to be an adult, no jakes.
Yeah. Well, that's easy.
It's a beard restriction. Which people laugh about, but
the 6-inch beard is maybe kind of tough until they're really close. Bird. But I mean, dude, you can tell a full fan from a mile away.
Yeah, as long as he's strutting.
I do know that. I'm not a turkey idiot. I remember when
an idiot.
I remember when I found out, I was like, oh, jakes don't have full fans. I didn't always understand it that way.
A lot of people don't.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Now
you know.
Toms have full fans. Jakes have, what is it? The 2 on the ends are shorter and the ones in the middle are longer?
the primaries are just longer in the middle.
Yeah, that was really helpful to find that out.
Stick around me, you'll learn more fun facts.
Dad was out scouting birds yesterday. Mom sent me a picture. My dad's just living the dream, just driving around scouting turkeys and
picking up sheds.
I am buying... I want to say 2 things too, real quick.
Yes.
I know this podcast is dragging on.
I have to pee, just so you know.
All right, I'll keep it short.
Okay.
Dude, Jed sent me a picture yesterday of a local, I forget what it's called. If anybody's interested, I'll figure it out. There's a Facebook group of They have like feeds and supplements, and they are posting pictures on Facebook of that 50-cent buck.
Oh yeah,
that Jed had a ton of pictures of, and that his neighbor killed, claiming that it's on this outfitter that uses this stuff. And so Jed wrote him and was like, dude, no, it's not. Like, this is from this property, and they know it. You know what I mean? They know that it's like 5 miles away, and
30,
maybe a little more, but it's not. It's not from that property.
I know a guy that him and her got it on. No,
he and her got it on.
No, he didn't.
Yeah. Anyways, I just wanted to tell you that. Oh, the other one was my buddy at the gym owns a turkey call company. So it's like I mean, they make diaphragms and stuff.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it's called either. His name's Colton. He's a cool dude. Beautiful beard. I don't know if it's a C or a K, Colton, that his name starts with. But anyways, I'm going to pick up some diaphragms from him this year.
About time to kill some turkeys.
Turkey diaphragm calls, recurve bows, freaking.
Yeah. Might as well get a ghillie suit while you're out.
2022 shaping up here, buddy. Also, North Dakota Point, don't forget.
Yeah.
Utah's still open, but closing soon.
Kansas in 2 weeks.
Montana's open. I just put in for Montana elk. That's an expensive one.
Yeah, racking them up.
But they reimburse you when you don't draw. So, Fourth Point in Iowa coming up. For any of you Iowa landowners.
In case you want us
that want to be friends with us.
Come kill bucks.
All right, that's all I got.
Last thing is, hopefully if you're listening to this, you've heard at least 2 episodes probably of I Bought a Farm, if not 3. But we're going to keep them rolling out here, so we appreciate all the support around that, and we will catch you next time.
Later.
Take me